Before the thunder of wagon wheels and the ring of railroad steel, before the dust clouds of cattle drives and the crack of gunfighters' colts, there stretched a continent of such breathtaking vastness that it defied human comprehension, a land where morning mist rose from prairies that rolled unbroken to horizons lost in blue infinity, where mountain ranges thrust their snow-crowned peaks toward heavens so vast they seemed to swallow the very concept of distance. This was a landscape sculpted by forces older than memory. The Great Plains stretched like a green ocean from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, an endless sea of buffalo grass that whispered ancient secrets in the wind. Here, beneath skies so immense they dwarfed human ambition, the earth itself breathed in seasonal rhythms unchanged since the last ice retreated northward. Spring brought torrential rains that turned the prairie into a carpet of wildflowers, Indian paintbrush, bluebonnet and black-eyed Susan painting the grasslands in colours that had no names in any European tongue. Summer blazed with such intensity that the air itself shimmered like water, while thunderheads built into towering cathedrals that unleashed lightning storms of biblical proportions across the plains. Beyond the grasslands, the Rocky Mountains rose like the backbone of the continent, their peaks catching the first light of dawn and holding the last glow of sunset long after darkness claimed the valleys below. Rivers born in high snowfields carved their paths through stone canyons deeper than cathedrals, their waters running clear and cold toward distant seas. The Colorado carved the Grand Canyon grain by grain, while the Missouri gathered the continent's waters into a brown torrent that would one day carry explorers into the heart of the unknown. And westward still, beyond desert ranges where the sun burned with furnace heat, lay California's golden valleys and the Pacific's endless expanse, where waves that had travelled 10,000 miles finally broke against shores touched by morning light. Yet this seemingly empty land pulsed with human life as rich and complex as any civilization that had ever flourished beneath the sun. For countless generations, native nations had called these vast spaces home, their societies woven as intricately into the landscape as the root systems of the prairie grasses themselves. The Lakota moved with the seasons across the northern plains, their teepees rising like geometric flowers on hills that stretched to infinity. They called themselves Oseti Sakowin, the Seven Council Fires, and their political structure reflected a sophistication that European observers rarely comprehended. Each band maintained its independence while participating in a large confederacy that could field thousands of warriors when threatened. Their relationship with Tatanka, the buffalo, transcended mere hunting. It was a sacred covenant that provided not just meat for sustenance, but hides for shelter, bones for tools, sinew for thread, and dung for fuel. The great herds moved in migrations that darkened the prairie like storm clouds, and the Lakota moved with them in a dance as old as the wind itself. To the south, the Comanche had transformed themselves through their mastery of the horse into the lords of the southern plains. Spanish conquistadors had brought horses to the Americas, but the Comanche made them extensions of their very souls. A Comanche warrior could fire arrows with deadly accuracy while hanging from the side of a galloping horse, could trade, fight, and live an entire life from horseback. Their raids swept across a territory larger than most European nations, their war parties striking like lightning across hundreds of miles before vanishing into the vastness they knew like the lines of their own palms. In the desert southwest, the Apache had learned to make the harshest landscape their ally. Where others saw barren wasteland, they found hidden springs, edible plants, and strategic positions that rendered them nearly invisible to enemies. Their spiritual beliefs centered on the concept of living in harmony with the land's fierce spirits, and their warriors became legends for their ability to appear and disappear like smoke on the wind. Geronimo's name would one day strike fear into the hearts of the U.S. Army, but long before his time, Apache bands had perfected the art of guerrilla warfare in terrain that could kill the unprepared in a single day. The Navajo, calling themselves Dine the People, built a different kind of empire in the Four Corners region where Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico would one day meet. They were master weavers and silversmiths, their blankets prized from Mexico to Canada, their jewellery incorporating techniques learned from Spanish craftsmen but elevated to heights the Spanish had never imagined. Their hogans faced east to welcome each day's first light, and their complex clan system maintained social order across hundreds of square miles of mesa and canyon country. Trade networks connected these nations in ways that European mapmakers could never have imagined. Shells from the Pacific Ocean found their way to villages on the Missouri River. Turquoise from New Mexico mines adorned the necks of chiefs beside the Great Lakes. Buffalo hides tanned by Lakota women became the walls of Apache dwellings. These trade relationships carried not just goods but ideas, stories, and innovations across distances that would challenge even 19th century transportation systems. Yet to the young United States of America in 1800, all of this vibrant complexity remained invisible, dismissed as empty wilderness, waiting for civilization. The edge of that civilization ended as abruptly as a knife cut at the Mississippi River, where the great waterway marked the boundary between the known and the unknowable. St. Louis perched on the west bank of the Mississippi like a watchtower at the edge of the world. Here, French fur traders who had lived among the tribes brought tales that strained the limits of Eastern imagination. They spoke of prairies so vast that a man could ride for weeks without seeing a single tree, of mountain peaks that scraped the very belly of heaven, of rivers that ran backward and falls that thundered with the voices of thunder beings. But beyond their trading posts and scattered missions, official America simply ended. Government maps of the period showed precise detail east of the Mississippi. Every county, every township, every navigable stream carefully documented. But west of the Great River, the maps dissolved into speculation and fantasy. Great American Desert appeared on some charts, suggesting a Sahara-like wasteland. Others showed a mythical River of the West flowing from the Rocky Mountains directly to the Pacific, promising an easy water route to the China trade. The reality: a continent of staggering diversity and complexity inhabited by millions of people whose civilizations had flourished for centuries, remained as mysterious to official America as the far side of the moon. This was the great silence before the storm, the last moment when two continents existed within the borders of what would become the United States. The familiar eastern seaboard with its cities and farms and constitutions, and the vast western expanse where different laws held sway, where human relationships with the land followed patterns older than written history, and where the very concept of ownership meant something entirely different under skies too immense for any deed or survey to contain. The storm was coming, though few could yet hear its distant thunder. In Paris, Napoleon Bonaparte was weighing decisions that would reshape the world. In Virginia, Thomas Jefferson was dreaming of an empire of liberty that would stretch from sea to shining sea. The collision between these two worlds, eastern and western, settled and nomadic, bounded and boundless, would create the epic we call the Wild West. But in 1800, the great continent still held its breath, waiting. The first ripples of that approaching storm took human form in the most unlikely of men-leather-faced wanderers who vanished into the mountain vastness for months at a time, emerging from the wilderness with tales so extraordinary that civilized society dismissed them as the ravings of men who had spent too long alone beneath the infinite sky. These were the mountain men, the fur trappers, the first wave of Americans to cross the great silence and learn its deepest secrets. Jim Bridger stood barely 5 feet 8 inches tall, but in the towering peaks of the Rocky Mountains he cast a shadow that stretched across decades. Born to a Virginia farming family that had drifted westward with the tide of settlement, Bridger found his true calling in 1822 when he answered William Ashley's legendary newspaper advertisement, calling for enterprising young men to ascend the Missouri River and venture into territories where no American had ever set foot. At 18, with calloused hands already hardened by frontier life, Bridger stepped into the wilderness and discovered a world that would consume the rest of his days. The mountains taught him their language slowly, season by brutal season. He learned to read weather in the shape of clouds building over distant peaks, to find water by following the flight patterns of ravens, to predict the movement of game by the way morning mist clung to valley floors. His knowledge of Western geography became so encyclopedic that government surveyors would later rely on his hand-drawn maps to chart territories larger than European kingdoms. But Bridger's greatest discovery came in the winter of 1824, when, following the Bear River south through country no white man had ever seen, he emerged onto the shores of a vast inland sea so salty that no fish could survive in its waters. He had found the Great Salt Lake, though it would be years before mapmakers believed his reports of an inland ocean in the heart of the continent. Hugh Glass embodied the terrible price the mountains demanded from those who dared enter their realm. In August 1823, while scouting ahead of his trapping party in what would one day become South Dakota, Glass stumbled between a grizzly sow and her cubs, a mistake that should have meant instant death. The bear's claws opened his scalp to the bone, tore flesh from his back in strips, and left him so mangled that his companions, certain he would die within hours, took his rifle and knife and left him to face his end alone. But Glass possessed something beyond ordinary human endurance. For 6 weeks he crawled across 200 miles of wilderness, his wounds festering with maggots that may have actually saved his life by cleaning away dead flesh, sustained by berries, roots, and the occasional carcass left by wolves. When he finally stumbled into Fort Kiowa, gaunt as a scarecrow and scarred beyond recognition, his survival became the stuff of legend throughout the fur trade. Jedediah Smith brought a different spirit to the high country, a Bible-reading Methodist who neither drank nor cursed, yet pushed deeper into unknown territory than any man of his generation. Smith's expeditions traced the Colorado River through its most treacherous canyons, crossed the Mojave Desert when it was still a blank space on every map, and pioneered the first overland route to California. His journals, written by campfire light with hands cramped by cold and exhaustion, provided the first accurate descriptions of the Great Basin, that vast high desert region between the Rockies and the Sierra Nevada, where ancient lake beds stretched like moonscapes beneath crystalline skies. In 1831, while leading a trading expedition to Santa Fe, Comanche warriors killed Smith at a waterhole along the Cimarron River. He was 32 years old and had seen more of the American West than Lewis and Clark, yet his discoveries remained locked in private journals until decades after his death. These mountain men did more than map unknown territory. They crossed the invisible boundary between worlds, living as cultural bridges between the native nations who had called the mountains home for centuries and the expanding American civilization that would soon follow their trails westward. To survive in the high country required more than courage and endurance. It demanded a willingness to abandon the assumptions of civilized life and adopt the wisdom of peoples who had learned to thrive in landscapes that could kill the unprepared in a single storm. They took native wives not from loneliness alone, though the isolation of winter trapping camps could drive men mad with solitude, but from practical necessity and genuine affection that grew into deep partnerships spanning decades. A Shoshone or Crow wife brought knowledge that no amount of Eastern education could provide, which plants could cure mountain fever, how to tan hides so they remained supple in 40 below cold, where to find sheltered valleys when early blizzards caught hunting parties far from base camps. These marriages created family networks that stretched across tribal territories, providing safe passage and trading opportunities that determined the difference between profit and bankruptcy, between reaching spring rendezvous and becoming another set of bleached bones scattered across some high meadow. Jim Beckworth married into the Crow Nation so completely that he rose to become a war chief, leading raids against traditional enemies and participating in the intricate diplomacy that governed relationships between tribes. His mixed African and European heritage mattered less in Crow society than his proven courage and his ability to understand the complex honor system that shaped Plains Indian warfare. For years at a time, Beckworth lived entirely within Crow culture, his cabin filled with relatives according to kinship systems that traced relationships through maternal lines back to ancestors who had lived beside these mountains when they were young. The annual rendezvous represented the genius of the American fur trader system that brought together the scattered resources of a vast region in weeks-long gatherings that combined business with celebration, cultural exchange, and the sharing of information that kept men alive in country where mistakes meant death. Each July, predetermined locations in mountain valleys became temporary cities, where trappers, traders, and tribal bands converged with pack trains loaded with the previous year's harvest of beaver pelts, buffalo robes, and other furs that Eastern fashion demanded. Pierre's Hole, Cache Valley, Green River. These names became legendary among the mountain men as sites where civilization and wilderness negotiated their complex relationship through trade, storytelling, and competitions that tested every skill the high country demanded. Traders from St. Louis arrived with pack trains carrying manufactured goods that seemed miraculous to men who had spent months with only what they could craft from stone, bone, and hide. Steel traps and knives, gunpowder and lead, sugar and coffee, blankets woven in eastern mills, and alcohol that flowed like water during the brief weeks when isolation gave way to community. Native bands brought their own trade goods, horses bred and trained on the Great Plains, expertly tanned hides decorated with quill work of stunning intricacy, dried meat processed for long-term storage, and knowledge of routes, seasons, and dangers that could mean survival for the coming year. The rendezvous operated as more than a market. It functioned as a diplomatic gathering where territorial agreements were negotiated, marriage alliances formed, and information shared about the movement of game, the location of hostile war parties, and the safest routes through country where a wrong turn could lead to starvation or death. Daily life in the trapping camps demanded skills that combined the technical knowledge of European metalworking with the environmental wisdom of peoples who had survived in the mountains for millennia. Before dawn, when stars still blazed with cold fire in the thin air, trappers waded into beaver ponds so cold that ice formed on their buckskins before they reached shore. Setting traps required intimate knowledge of beaver behavior, where they built their dams, which channels they used for nighttime foraging, how to position steel jaws so that a struggling animal would drown quickly rather than escape with a mangled paw. The work destroyed men's bodies with methodical efficiency. Constant immersion in freezing water brought on arthritis that crippled fingers and joints. High altitude and brutal weather-age faces until 30-year-old men looked like grandfathers. Scurvy-rotted teeth and open wounds that wouldn't heal. Yet something in the vastness, in the terrible beauty of sunrise over peaks that had no names, in the absolute silence that followed blizzards, called to spirits that could find no peace in civilized settlements. They lived hard and died young, these first Americans to call the mountains home, but their trails would guide the wagons that followed, and their knowledge would open the West to a nation that had begun to dream of empire beneath Pacific skies. The trails blazed by mountain men became highways of dreams as a restless hunger seized the American spirit in the 1840s, a yearning that transcended simple wanderlust and touched something deeper in the national soul. Families who had never ventured beyond the borders of their home counties began selling everything they owned to purchase canvas-topped wagons and teams of oxen, driven by visions of fertile valleys beyond the sunset, where land cost nothing but the courage to claim it. The restless impulse that would soon send 500,000 Americans westward along the Oregon Trail sprang from roots as tangled as prairie grass. Economic depression had gripped the nation since 1837, leaving farmers unable to pay their debts, and craftsmen without work in towns where banks had shuttered their doors and businesses had withered like crops in drought. But beneath the immediate pressures of hard times lay something more profound, the same wandering spirit that had carried their ancestors across the Atlantic and driven each generation a little further into the continent's heart. Letters from missionaries in Oregon Territory painted pictures of an Eden beyond the mountains where wheat grew taller than a man's head, where cattle fattened on grass that stayed green year-round, where timber stood so thick and straight that a single tree could frame an entire house. These reports, published in newspapers that circulated from village to village, ignited imaginations already kindled by the democratic ideal that any man willing to work could better his condition if only he could find the right place to make his stand. The federal government's promise of free land 160 acres to any family willing to settle and farm in Oregon transformed abstract dreams into practical possibilities that ordinary people could almost touch. Religious fervour added another layer to the westward pull, as Protestant denominations competed to establish missions among the native tribes of Oregon and California. Missionary societies preached that Christian farmers could bring both salvation and civilization to the wilderness, creating a moral imperative that sanctified what might otherwise have seemed mere land hunger. Young couples saw their westward journey as both material advancement and divine calling, a chance to build new communities founded on principles of industry, sobriety and faith beneath skies that had never known the shadow of European corruption. The Oregon Trail itself stretched like a thread across 2,000 miles of the most challenging terrain on the continent, following routes that mountain men and fur traders had marked with their own blood and determination, beginning at jumping-off points along the Missouri River Independence Center's Joseph, Council Bluffs. The trail wound through Kansas grasslands where prairie fires could race faster than horses, crossed the Platte River where quicksand waited to swallow wagons whole, climbed through South Pass in the Rocky Mountains where snow might fall in July, and descended through the Blue Mountains of eastern Oregon, where every mile tested the endurance of oxen already worn down by months of grinding travel. Dawn on the Oregon Trail came with the sound of bugles echoing across encampments scattered along the river bottoms, calling families from their bedrolls beneath wagon covers that had become home for months of crawling westward progress. While stars still pricked the pre-dawn darkness, women kindled fires with buffalo chips and precious wood gathered the evening before, setting coffee to boil and bacon to sizzle in cast-iron skillets that would serve as their kitchens until they reached journey's end. Men itched teams in the grey light, checking harnesses worn thin by constant use, examining hooves for stones or splits that could lame an ox and leave a family stranded hundreds of miles from anywhere. The daily rhythm followed patterns established by necessity and refined through the shared wisdom of previous emigrants. "Catch up! Catch up!" wagon masters shouted as the sun climbed above the horizon, and the great procession lurched into motion, sometimes stretching for miles across the prairie like a vast serpent made of canvas and hope. Dust rose in choking clouds that coated everything with fine powder, settling in food, clothes, and lungs until emigrants learned to tie bandanas across their faces and accept that cleanliness belonged to their former lives. Children walked beside the wagons to spare the oxen unnecessary weight, their bare feet growing hard as leather on trails worn smooth by thousands of hooves and wagon wheels. River crossings tested courage and skill in equal measure as families faced torrents that could sweep away months of preparation in a single moment of miscalculation. At the North Platte, the Kansas, the Snake, emigrants gathered on the banks to debate the best crossing points while their animals rested and children played in eddies where the current seemed manageable. Some rivers required ferries built from wagon boxes corked with tar and tallow, while others demanded fording at points where men walked ahead with ropes, testing the bottom for holes that could trap a wagon or quicksand that gave no warning before it claimed everything. Mountain passes brought different challenges as the trail climbed through country, where the air grew thin and storms could strike without warning even in midsummer. At South Pass, the Continental Divide crossed in a broad saddle so gradual that many emigrants didn't realize they had reached the spine of the continent until someone pointed out that streams now flowed west toward the Pacific. But the descent into Oregon Territory tested wagons and nerves as steep grades forced families to lock their wheels and lower their possessions by rope down mountainsides where a single mistake could send everything tumbling into canyons too deep to measure. Prairie storms arrived like divine judgment, building from innocent clouds on the horizon into towering thunderheads that turned day to night and unleashed hail the size of hens' eggs. Lightning struck with such frequency that the very air crackled with electricity, while wind-driven rain turned dusty trails into rivers of mud that could bog down entire wagon trains for days. Families huddled in their wagons listening to thunder that seemed to shake the earth itself, while hail drummed against canvas covers with the sound of gunfire and wind threatened to overturn everything they owned. Graves marked the westward path like mile markers of sorrow, crude headstones and simple wooden crosses that told stories of dreams ended too soon. Cholera killed fastest and cruelest, striking healthy adults without warning and claiming entire families within days of the first symptoms. Children succumbed to dysentery, pneumonia, and accidents that would have been minor inconveniences in settled country, but became death sentences where the nearest doctor might be 1,000 miles away. Women died in childbirth far from the midwives and female relatives who might have saved them, their newborns sometimes buried in the same graves beside trails that had become rivers of grief as well as hope. The sounds and smells of wagon trains created a sensory symphony that emigrants would remember for the rest of their lives. Wagon wheels creaked with rhythms that became as familiar as heartbeats, while the lowing of oxen mixed with the crack of whips, the shouts of drivers, and the constant murmur of families calling to each other across the dust. Smoke from cooking fires carried the aroma of bacon and beans, coffee and cornbread, while the smell of animals, unwashed bodies, and leather permeated everything. At night, the sound of fiddles and harmonicas drifted across camps where families gathered around fires to sing hymns and folk songs that connected them to the homes they had left behind. Women's voices, though often absent from official histories, shaped the westward migration as profoundly as any wagon master or trail guide. Sarah Winnemucca, born to a northern Paiute family in what would become Nevada, witnessed the collision between her people's world and the endless stream of emigrants crossing their ancestral lands. Educated in white schools but never abandoning her native identity, she served as translator, guide, and advocate, trying to build bridges between cultures that seemed destined for conflict. Her autobiography, published in 1883, provided one of the few Native American perspectives on the Great Migration, describing how the long line of wagons appeared to her people like a big snake stretching across the desert, bringing change that could not be turned back. Narcissa Whitman travelled to Oregon in 1836 as one of the first white women to cross the Rocky Mountains, accompanying her missionary husband to establish a station among the Cayuse tribe. Her letters home, published in Eastern newspapers, helped fuel the Oregon fever that would bring thousands of families westward in her wake. She wrote of the beautiful country beyond the mountains, of soil so rich that everything grows without cultivation, and of native peoples she believed could be transformed through Christian teaching and agricultural instruction. Her story ended in tragedy in 1847 when Cayuse warriors, believing the Whitmans had brought disease that was killing their children, attacked the mission and killed 14 people. But her early descriptions of Oregon's promise had already planted seeds in American imaginations that would bloom into the Great Migration of the 1840s. When the surviving emigrants finally descended from the Blue Mountains and looked out over the Willamette Valley, they found a landscape that seemed to justify every hardship they had endured. Rivers ran clear and cold from mountain snowfields. Forests of Douglas fir and cedar stretched to horizons that disappeared in morning mist, and meadows of native grass provided pasture for cattle brought across 2,000 miles of desert and mountain. Here, beneath skies that promised rain enough to grow crops without the constant worry that haunted farmers on the Great Plains, families could claim their 160 acres and begin the work of turning wilderness into the America they carried in their hearts. While families in Oregon Territory were still clearing stumps from their first fields and building cabins from the endless forests that surrounded them, a discovery in the foothills of California's Sierra Nevada would transform the entire West in ways that no one could have imagined. On the morning of January 24, 1848, James Wilson Marshall was inspecting the mill race at Sutter's Mill, a sawmill he was building for Swiss immigrant John Sutter along the South Fork of the American River, when something glittering in the shallow water caught his attention. Marshall bent down and picked up what appeared to be a piece of metal, yellow and heavy, about half the size of a pea. His pulse quickened as he examined the specimen, testing it by hammering it with a rock to see if it would flatten like gold or shatter like fool's gold. The metal bent without breaking, maintaining its lustrous colour even after being beaten thin. He gathered several more pieces, his excitement growing with each discovery, and that evening showed his finds to the mill workers who helped him test the metal with lye from their soap-making supplies. When the metal emerged from the caustic bath unchanged, they knew they had found gold. John Sutter received the news with dread rather than joy, understanding instinctively that gold discovery would mean the end of his carefully built agricultural empire in California's Central Valley. For weeks he and Marshall tried to keep the discovery secret, hoping to complete the mill and harvest their crops before word spread. But gold, like water, finds its own level, and by March, rumors were circulating through California's small population of Mexican ranchers, American settlers, and native workers that the precious metal lay scattered in the streams of the Sierra foothills, free for the taking to anyone willing to bend their back and work a pan or rocker. Sam Brannan, a Mormon entrepreneur who owned a store at Sutter's Fort, transformed rumor into frenzy when he walked through the streets of San Francisco in May 1848, holding aloft a bottle filled with gold dust and shouting, "Gold! Gold! Gold from the American River!" Within days, San Francisco's population had fled to the gold fields, leaving behind a near ghost town where ships sat abandoned in the harbour, and businesses closed their doors as clerks, lawyers, and labourers all rushed eastward into the foothills to seek their fortunes in the streams where Marshall had made his fateful discovery. News of California gold reached the East Coast in December 1848, when President James K. Polk confirmed the discovery in his annual message to Congress, displaying a tea caddy filled with 230 ounces of California gold that had been sent to Washington as proof. The confirmation set off a global migration that dwarfed even the Great Oregon Trail exodus, as gold seekers from every corner of the earth converged on California in what became known as the greatest voluntary migration in human history. The 49ers came from everywhere and nowhere, united only by the democratic dream that gold cared nothing for a man's birth, education, or previous station in life. Farm boys from Ohio sold their land to buy passage around Cape Horn, while clerks from Boston borrowed money to outfit themselves for the overland journey across the continent. Experienced miners from Georgia and North Carolina brought knowledge of placer mining techniques, while greenhorns who had never held a pick or pan in their lives relied on guidebooks written by men who had never been within 1,000 miles of California. Chinese gold seekers, fleeing poverty and civil war in Guangdong province, called California Gamsan Gold Mountain, and borrowed money from family associations to pay for passage across the Pacific. They brought mining techniques perfected in the streams of southern China, along with customs and languages that bewildered Americans who had never encountered Asian immigrants in significant numbers. Many Chinese miners worked claims that white miners had abandoned as played out, using patient hand methods to extract gold that mechanical mining had missed, sending their earnings back to China to support families they hoped to rejoin once they had made their fortunes. Mexican miners, called Sonoranos after the state many came from, possessed mining skills learned in silver camps that stretched back to Spanish colonial times. They understood how to read the geology of gold-bearing streams, how to build rocker boxes and long toms that could process more dirt than simple pans, and how to organize cooperative mining ventures that pooled labor and resources. Yet despite their expertise, Mexican miners faced increasing hostility from American gold seekers who resented their success and used California's new foreign miners' tax to drive them from the richest claims. Chilean miners brought techniques learned in the copper and silver mines of the Andes, along with a tradition of hard rock mining that would prove invaluable as California's easy placer deposits played out and mining moved underground. They established settlements in the southern foothills where they recreated the social structures of their homeland, building churches and schools and maintaining cultural traditions that helped them survive the isolation and hardship of gold rush life. San Francisco's transformation from a sleepy Mexican village called Yerba Buena to the largest city on the Pacific coast happened with a speed that defied human comprehension. When gold fever struck in 1848, San Francisco's population numbered fewer than 1,000 residents, most of them Mexican and native families who had lived there for generations. By 1850, the city housed more than 25,000 people, with new arrivals pouring in daily on ships that crowded the harbour like a forest of masts and rigging. The city grew without plan or order, as entrepreneurs threw up buildings as quickly as lumber could be unloaded, from ships that had sailed around Cape Horn, loaded with prefabricated structures from New England mills. Canvas tents and wooden shanties crowded together along muddy streets that became impassable quagmires when winter rains turned the city into a vast swamp. Real estate prices soared to levels that seemed insane even to men who had grown wealthy panning gold from mountain streams, as lots that had sold for $60 in 1847 commanded $45,000 by 1850. Gambling halls and saloons operated 24 hours a day, catering to miners who came to the city to spend their gold dust on pleasures unavailable in the mining camps. The El Dorado, the Parker House, and other establishments featured crystal chandeliers imported from Europe, mahogany bars that had sailed around Cape Horn, and gambling tables where fortunes won in the mines could disappear in a single evening's play. Prostitutes arrived from Mexico, Chile, France, and China, establishing brothels that catered to men who hadn't seen women in months and had gold enough to pay whatever prices the market demanded. Fire became the city's greatest enemy, as wooden buildings dried by California's rainless summers burned like tinder when accidents or arson set them ablaze. The Great Fire of May 1851 destroyed 2,000 buildings in 10 hours, but San Francisco's residents rebuilt with characteristic determination, raising new structures on the ashes of the old before the ruins had finished smouldering. Each fire seemed only to intensify the city's energy, as if destruction and renewal were natural cycles in a place where nothing stayed the same long enough to become permanent. Mining life in the Sierra foothills combined backbreaking labor with the constant possibility of sudden wealth, creating communities where millionaires and paupers worked side by side in streams that might yield an ounce of gold one day and nothing the next. Miners rose before dawn to work their claims in the brief hours before the Sierra sun turned the foothills into furnaces, standing knee-deep in water so cold that it numbed their legs even in midsummer, swirling dirt and gravel in pans while their backs ached and their hands cracked from constant immersion in icy streams. The work required infinite patience and eternal optimism, as miners moved tons of dirt and rock to find ounces of gold scattered through the gravel like seeds in soil. A good day might yield enough gold dust to buy supplies and a few luxuries. A bad week could leave a man wondering if he should abandon his claim and try his luck elsewhere. Fortunes appeared and disappeared with the caprice of streams that shifted course in winter floods, burying rich deposits under tons of new gravel, while exposing other deposits that had waited centuries for discovery. Mining camps sprouted wherever gold was found, ramshackle collections of tents and shanties with names like Hangtown, Rough and Ready, and You Bet that reflected both the humour and desperation of men far from home and civilization. These communities developed their own laws and customs, governed by miners' meetings where democratic votes decided everything from claim disputes to the punishment of thieves and claim jumpers. Justice was rough but generally fair, administered by men who understood that survival in the wilderness required cooperation even among competitors. While miners scraped gold from Sierra streams and San Francisco rose from mudflats into a gleaming metropolis, the very ground beneath their feet was being transformed by forces larger than individual dreams of fortune, the inexorable expansion of a young nation that had begun to see its destiny written in the stars themselves. The phrase that would justify this continental conquest had already entered the American vocabulary in 1845, when journalist John O'Sullivan wrote that it was the nation's manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. Manifest destiny became more than a political slogan. It crystallized into a religious conviction that God himself had ordained American expansion from Atlantic to Pacific shores. The doctrine proclaimed that American institutions, democracy, Protestantism, and free enterprise represented the highest form of human civilization, and that spreading these blessings across the continent was both a divine mandate and a natural law, as inevitable as the rising sun. This belief transformed territorial aggression into moral crusade, conquest into liberation, and the displacement of existing peoples into the march of progress toward a more perfect society. The concept resonated through American society with the power of revealed truth, preached from pulpits where ministers found biblical justification for westward expansion, debated in Congress where politicians wrapped territorial ambitions in the language of national mission, and embraced by common citizens who saw in westward movement both personal opportunity and patriotic duty. Manifest Destiny provided the ideological foundation for policies that would reshape the continent, offering moral certainty to a nation that had begun to hunger for land, with an appetite that seemed insatiable as the prairies themselves. Yet this divine destiny would require human agency to fulfill, and the first great test came in Texas, where American settlers had been invited by Mexico to populate its northern frontier, but had brought with them customs, laws, and loyalties that made conflict inevitable. Stephen F. Austin had led the first organized colonization in the 1820s, establishing settlements along the Brazos and Colorado rivers, where cotton grew as white as clouds against the endless sky, and cattle multiplied on grasslands that stretched beyond the curve of earth. The Texas Revolution erupted in 1835 when Mexican President Antonio López de Santa Anna attempted to centralize power and eliminate the local autonomy that Anglo settlers had come to consider their birthright. What began as resistance to specific policies escalated into full rebellion when Texas colonists declared independence and formed a provisional government that claimed sovereignty over territory larger than France. Santa Anna responded with military force, leading an army of 6,000 regulars north across the Rio Grande to crush the rebellion before it could spread to other Mexican states. The Siege of the Alamo in San Antonio became the crucible where Texas independence was forged in blood and fire. For 13 days in March 1836, fewer than 200 defenders held the old Spanish mission against Santa Anna's overwhelming force, knowing that relief would not come and that their sacrifice would serve a larger purpose than their individual survival. William Barrett Travis, commanding the garrison, wrote letters that would become part of American mythology, declaring that he would never surrender or retreat, and calling upon his countrymen to come to our aid with all dispatch. When the final assault came before dawn on March 6th, Mexican soldiers swarmed over the mission walls like a human tide, overwhelming defenders who sold their lives as dearly as courage could manage. Jim Bowie died in his sickbed, pistols in both hands, while Davy Crockett fell fighting with his rifle as a club when his ammunition ran out. Travis died at his cannon, shot through the head while trying to inspire his men to one last stand. The slaughter was complete, every defender killed. Their bodies burned on pyres that sent smoke rising like prayers toward the Texas sky. "Remember the Alamo" became the battle cry that carried Sam Houston's army to victory at San Jacinto 6 weeks later, where Texas forces routed Santa Anna's army in 18 minutes of furious combat that settled the revolution in a single morning. Santa Anna himself was captured hiding in the reeds of Buffalo Bayou, disguised in a private's uniform but betrayed when his own soldiers saluted him as El Presidente. Under duress, he signed treaties recognizing Texas independence, though Mexico refused to ratify agreements made under coercion and continued to claim sovereignty over its lost province. Texas remained an independent republic for nearly a decade, developing its own currency, postal system, and diplomatic relationships while seeking annexation by the United States. The annexation question divided American politics along sectional lines. The southern states favored adding another slave territory, while northern politicians feared disrupting the delicate balance between free and slave states. The issue was finally resolved in 1845 when Congress approved annexation by joint resolution, but the decision set the stage for war with Mexico, which had never recognized Texas independence and considered American annexation an act of aggression. The Mexican-American War began in 1846 with skirmishes along the Rio Grande, where American and Mexican forces disputed the boundary between Texas and Mexico. President James K. Polk, an ardent expansionist who had campaigned on promises to acquire California and settle the Oregon boundary question, used these border incidents to justify a declaration of war that many critics denounced as aggressive conquest disguised as defensive necessity. American blood has been shed on American soil, Polk declared to Congress, though the soil in question was disputed territory that Mexico had never formally ceded to Texas. The war revealed both American military competence and the vast distances that would challenge any army operating in the Mexican borderlands. General Zachary Taylor's forces crossed the Rio Grande and advanced south through landscapes that seemed designed to swallow armies, whole deserts where water was scarce and precious, mountains that rose like fortress walls against the sky, and valleys where summer heat could kill soldiers faster than enemy bullets. At Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma, American artillery proved superior to Mexican tactics, while at Monterrey, Taylor's infantry fought house to house through streets that ran red with blood from both armies. The decisive campaign came when General Winfield Scott landed at Veracruz and marched inland along the route that Cortes had followed 3 centuries earlier, advancing through tropical lowlands where yellow fever and dysentery killed more soldiers than combat, climbing through mountain passes where the air grew thin and cold, and finally approaching Mexico City across the high plateau where Aztec emperors had once ruled an empire that stretched from sea to sea. The battles of Contreras, Churubusco, and Chapultepec demonstrated American tactical superiority while revealing the desperate courage of Mexican defenders who fought for their homeland against invaders they saw as foreign conquerors. At Chapultepec Castle, teenage cadets from Mexico's military academy died defending their school rather than surrender to American forces, their sacrifice remembered in Mexican history as heroic martyrdom, while American accounts praised their courage even as they recorded their defeat. When American flags finally flew over the National Palace in Mexico City, the war was essentially over, though guerrilla resistance continued in the countryside, where Mexican irregulars harassed supply lines and demonstrated that conquest was easier than pacification. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed on February 2, 1848, ended the war by transforming the map of North America with a few strokes of diplomatic pens. Mexico ceded nearly half its national territory to the United States, the modern states of California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona and New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming in exchange for $15 million in cash and the assumption of Mexican debts owed to American citizens. The treaty guaranteed that Mexican residents of the ceded territories could choose to become American citizens or return to Mexico, though in practice many found their property rights challenged and their cultural traditions under assault from Anglo settlers who regarded Mexican law and custom as obstacles to progress and development. The cultural collision that followed created the figure of the American cowboy from the fusion of Mexican vaquero traditions with Anglo ranching practices, as Texas cattlemen adopted the techniques, equipment, and vocabulary that had evolved on Mexican haciendas over centuries of experience with semi-wild cattle on vast unfenced ranges. The same westward expansion that brought American settlers into conflict with Mexico carried them inevitably into collision with the native nations whose ancestors had called these lands home since the retreat of the last ice age. The pattern that would define Indian-white relations for the next half-century was established in these early conflicts. Treaties made with solemn ceremony and broken with casual indifference, promises of permanent boundaries that lasted only until white settlement pressure made new boundaries necessary, and negotiations conducted in the language of peace while both sides prepared for war. The treaty system itself embodied a fundamental misunderstanding of Native American political structures, as federal negotiators assumed they were dealing with centralized governments that could speak for entire tribes and enforce agreements across vast territories. In reality, most native nations operated through consensus-based systems, where individual bands maintained considerable autonomy, and no single leader could commit his people to agreements without broad consultation and consent. Chiefs who signed treaties in Washington often returned home to find that their authority to make such commitments was questioned by warriors and band leaders who had not participated in the negotiations. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 exemplified both the promise and the futility of the treaty process, bringing together representatives of the Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Crow, and other Plains tribes in the largest gathering of native peoples in American history. More than 10,000 Indians camped along the North Platte River, while government negotiators promised that tribal boundaries would be respected and that the United States would protect native peoples from encroachment by white settlers. In exchange, the tribes agreed to allow safe passage for emigrants on the Oregon Trail and to accept the construction of roads and military posts in their territories. The treaty lasted less than 3 years before violations on both sides made it meaningless. White emigrants wandered off established trails to hunt game and gather wood. Soldiers built forts in locations not specifically authorized by treaty language, and tribal raiding parties continued traditional warfare against hereditary enemies without regard for new boundaries drawn on maps they had never seen. When Lieutenant John Grattan led 29 soldiers into a Lakota camp near Fort Laramie in 1854 to arrest a warrior accused of killing a Mormon emigrant's cow, the confrontation escalated into a battle that left Grattan and all his men dead, effectively ending the peace that had been purchased with such ceremony just 3 years earlier. Red Cloud's War erupted in 1866 when the U.S. Army began construction of forts along the Bozeman Trail, a route that cut through the heart of Lakota hunting grounds to reach the gold fields of Montana Territory. Red Cloud, an Oglala war leader whose strategic mind and diplomatic skill made him the most formidable opponent the U.S. Army would face on the northern plains, understood that the trail and its protecting forts represented the beginning of permanent white occupation of lands guaranteed to his people by treaty. The Fetterman Massacre of December 21, 1866, demonstrated Red Cloud's tactical brilliance and the Army's dangerous underestimation of Plains Indian military capability. Captain William Fetterman, boasting that he could ride through the entire Sioux Nation with 80 good men, led exactly that number of soldiers from Fort Phil Kearny in pursuit of what appeared to be a small raiding party attacking the fort's woodcutting detail. The raiders, led by the young Oglala warrior Crazy Horse, drew Fetterman's command over Lodge Trail Ridge and into a carefully prepared ambush where 2,000 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors waited in concealment. The annihilation of Fetterman's entire command in less than an hour sent shockwaves through the Army hierarchy and demonstrated that Plains Indians had mastered tactical concepts that West Point graduates had studied in theory but never faced in practice. Red Cloud's forces controlled the countryside around the Bozeman Trail forts so completely that supply convoys required heavy escort and even then sometimes failed to get through, while the garrisons remained virtual prisoners inside their stockades, unable to venture far without risking destruction. The war ended in 1868 with the Second Fort Laramie Treaty, which represented the high water mark of federal concessions to Plains Indian demands. The U.S. Army abandoned the Bozeman Trail forts, which Red Cloud's warriors burned to the ground as soon as the soldiers marched away, and recognized Lakota sovereignty over the Black Hills and a vast Great Sioux reservation stretching from the Missouri River to the Bighorn Mountains. Red Cloud traveled to Washington to meet with President Ulysses S. Grant, becoming one of the few Indian leaders to force the United States to negotiate from a position of military defeat rather than victory. Yet even as Red Cloud was winning his war in the north, other conflicts revealed the terrible price of resistance when native forces faced opponents who had abandoned any pretense of limiting warfare to combatants. The Sand Creek Massacre of November 29, 1864, exposed the murderous potential of white racial hatred when it was given official sanction and military organization. Black Kettle, a Cheyenne peace chief who had spent years trying to find accommodation between his people and American expansion, had led his band to Sand Creek in southeastern Colorado Territory because Army officers had assured him it was a place of safety where peaceful Indians would be protected from the conflicts raging across the plains. The band flew both American and white flags above their lodges as symbols of their peaceful intentions, and Black Kettle possessed safe conduct papers from federal officials guaranteeing his people's security. Colonel John Chivington, a former Methodist minister who commanded Colorado's volunteer cavalry, had different ideas about how to solve the Indian problem. Kill and scalp all, big and little, he told his men as they surrounded the sleeping village in the grey dawn of November 29th. Nits make lice, he added. making clear that women and children were to be considered legitimate military targets rather than innocents to be protected according to the customs of civilized warfare. The slaughter that followed horrified, even hardened frontier soldiers when details emerged during subsequent congressional investigations. Chivington's men killed more than 150 Cheyenne, most of them women, children and elderly men who had remained in camp while the warriors were away hunting. Soldiers scalped the dead and mutilated bodies in ways that shocked investigators who had seen the aftermath of many frontier battles. Black Kettle himself survived the massacre, though his wife was badly wounded, and the peace chief continued to advocate for accommodation even after witnessing the fruits of his trust in American promises. The massacre had consequences that extended far beyond Sand Creek, as word of the atrocity spread throughout the Plains tribes and convinced many previously neutral bands that accommodation with white expansion was impossible. Young warriors who had been counseled toward a peace by their elders now demanded revenge, while chiefs who had advocated negotiation found their influence undermined by the undeniable evidence that American officials could not be trusted to honor even the most basic agreements about protecting peaceful Indians. Military forts scattered across the western landscape like islands of federal authority in an ocean of contested territory, each post representing both the promise of protection for white settlers and the threat of military action against native peoples who refused to accept American sovereignty over their ancestral lands. Fort Laramie, Fort Kearny, Fort Riley, and dozens of other installations served as bases for cavalry patrols that ranged hundreds of miles from their home stations, supply depots that sustained military operations across vast distances, and symbols of American determination to control the continent regardless of native opposition. Life at these isolated posts combined military routine with the constant awareness that hostile forces might appear on any horizon without warning. Soldiers drilled on parade grounds scraped from prairie sod while their wives hung laundry on lines that provided convenient targets for snipers hidden in nearby drawers. Officers' quarters and enlisted barracks were built to withstand siege, with thick walls and firing ports that could accommodate rifle barrels, while water supplies were secured inside the post perimeter to prevent enemies from cutting off access to the springs and streams that made frontier military life possible. The systematic destruction of the great buffalo herds represented a form of warfare more devastating than any military campaign. As white hunters armed with long-range rifles and supported by railroad transportation networks slaughtered millions of animals whose existence had sustained Plains Indian civilization for centuries. General Philip Sheridan, commanding the Division of the Missouri, understood that buffalo represented the economic foundation of Indian resistance, and he encouraged commercial hunting as a military strategy that would force native peoples onto reservations more effectively than direct combat. Professional hunters like Buffalo Bill Cody could kill hundreds of animals in a single day, using high-powered rifles to drop buffalo at ranges that made return fire impossible, while working with teams of skinners who processed carcasses for hides that brought premium prices in eastern markets hungry for leather goods. The slaughter was so efficient and so thorough that herds numbering in millions were reduced to scattered remnants within a decade, transforming the Great Plains from a landscape dominated by buffalo-based ecosystems into empty grasslands waiting for cattle and farmers to claim the ecological niche that buffalo had occupied since the end of the last ice age. Even as buffalo herds thundered toward extinction and cavalry patrols pursued ghost-like war parties across endless grasslands, a different kind of conquest was taking shape in the minds of visionaries who dreamed of binding the continent together with ribbons of steel. The idea of a transcontinental railroad had seemed like pure fantasy when engineer Theodore Judah first surveyed the Sierra Nevada in the 1850s, searching for a route that could carry locomotives over mountain peaks that scraped the belly of heaven itself. Yet what had once appeared impossible was becoming inevitable, driven by the same restless energy that had carried Americans across 2,000 miles of wilderness in search of gold and land and the promise of something better beyond the next horizon. The Pacific Railway Act of 1862, signed by Abraham Lincoln in the midst of a civil war that threatened to tear the nation apart, represented an act of faith in American engineering capability and national destiny that bordered on the miraculous. The legislation authorized two companies, the Union Pacific Building westward from Omaha and the Central Pacific Building eastward from Sacramento, to construct a continuous line of track across deserts, mountains, and plains that had already claimed thousands of lives from emigrants who had attempted the crossing, with nothing more than wagons and oxen to carry them toward their dreams. The engineering challenges seemed designed to test the outer limits of human ingenuity and determination. The Central Pacific would need to blast through granite walls that had stood since the Earth was young, building roadbeds across chasms where a single mistake could send entire work crews tumbling into depth that had no bottom. The Union Pacific faced different but equally daunting obstacles as it pushed across the Great Plains, where winter blizzards could bury construction camps under 20 feet of snow and summer storms unleashed tornadoes that could pick up boxcars and scatter them like children's toys across the prairie. Chinese workers, recruited from the goldfields and from villages in Guangdong province, where famine and war had made emigration a matter of survival rather than choice, became the backbone of Central Pacific construction through the Sierra Nevada mountains, where winter temperatures dropped to 40 below zero and avalanches swept away entire work camps without warning. These men, many weighing less than 130 pounds and standing barely 5 feet tall, accomplished feats of engineering that seasoned construction bosses had declared impossible, lowering themselves down sheer cliff faces in wicker baskets to drill holes for black powder charges while the granite walls echoed with the sound of hammers striking steel. The Chinese brought techniques learned in the construction of the Great Wall and other massive engineering projects that had shaped their homeland for centuries, understanding instinctively how to move enormous quantities of rock and earth using simple tools, human muscle, and the kind of patient persistence that could wear down mountains grain by grain. They worked in crews organized around family and village relationships that had survived the journey across the Pacific, sharing risks and rewards according to customs that stretched back through dynasties of collective labor on projects that dwarfed individual human lifespans. Their daily rations reflected both practical nutrition and cultural preference, as Chinese cooks prepared meals of rice, dried vegetables, and tea, while Irish and other European workers subsisted on beef, beans, and whiskey. The Chinese diet, richer in vitamins and served with tea that had been boiled to kill bacteria, kept them healthier than their European counterparts, who suffered from scurvy, dysentery, and other diseases that plagued construction camps throughout the American West. Chinese herbal medicine, dismissed by white supervisors as superstition, proved remarkably effective at treating altitude sickness, frostbite, and the various injuries that came from working with explosives in terrain that seemed designed to kill anyone foolish enough to challenge its ancient stability. The winter of 1866-67 nearly broke the Central Pacific as Sierra Nevada storms buried the construction camps under snowdrifts that reached the tops of telegraph poles, forcing workers to tunnel through white darkness that lasted for months, while they continued blasting and grading by lamplight in a world that had been reduced to the narrow confines of snow-walled passages that connected bunkhouses, work sites, and supply dumps. Avalanches swept away entire camps without warning, carrying men and equipment into canyons where spring thaws would reveal the scattered remains of human ambition, crushed by forces that made earthquakes seem gentle by comparison. Irish workers dominated Union Pacific construction crews as the railroad pushed westward across Nebraska and Wyoming territories, where the engineering challenges were less dramatic but equally dangerous in their own way. These men, many of them veterans of Civil War campaigns where they had learned to build and destroy infrastructure with military efficiency, brought skills in grading, bridging, and track laying that had been perfected in the crucible of modern warfare. They could lay miles of track in a single day when conditions were right, working with the rhythm and coordination of soldiers who understood that survival depended on each man doing his job with absolute reliability while trusting his companions to do the same. The Irish crews faced constant harassment from native war parties who understood that the railroad represented a more permanent threat to their way of life, than emigrant wagons or even military forts, since the Iron Road would bring unlimited numbers of settlers and soldiers to territories that had remained largely unchanged since the last ice age. Lakota and Cheyenne raiders struck construction camps and isolated work crews with the same tactical skill they employed against cavalry patrols, appearing from nowhere to kill workers and destroy equipment before vanishing into landscape that could swallow entire armies without leaving a trace. The competition between the Central Pacific and Union Pacific intensified as both companies realized that federal subsidies would be distributed according to miles of track completed, creating a race across the continent where speed became more important than careful construction, and corners were cut with an abandon that would cause problems for decades to come. Central Pacific crews, having conquered the Sierra Nevada, began laying track across the Nevada desert at rates that amazed even their own engineers, while Union Pacific crews pushed across Wyoming and into Utah Territory with equal determination to claim as many miles as possible before the two railroads met. Both companies employed armies of surveyors, graders, bridge builders, track layers, and support personnel that numbered in the tens of thousands, creating mobile cities that moved westward with the advancing railheads, like military campaigns designed to conquer distance itself. Supply trains carried everything from steel rails manufactured in Pennsylvania mills to beef cattle driven up from Texas ranches, while telegraph lines followed the railroad construction to provide communication links that could coordinate the movement of men and materials across distances that had previously required weeks of travel to traverse. The final months of construction became a frenzied competition as both railroads worked within sight of each other, grading parallel roadbeds through Utah Territory, while Congress debated where the two lines should officially meet. Chinese and Irish workers, who had approached each other across 800 miles of some of the most challenging terrain on the continent, could finally see the end of their monumental task approaching like dawn after the longest night in human memory. On May 10th, 1869, at Promontory Summit in the desert north of the Great Salt Lake, the impossible dream became reality as the Central Pacific's locomotive Jupiter faced the Union Pacific's Engine 119 across a gap of only a few feet that represented the last unconquered distance between the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. Leland Stanford, president of the Central Pacific, and Thomas Durant, vice president of the Union Pacific, drove ceremonial spikes made of California gold and Nevada silver into a tie of polished laurel wood, while telegraph operators flashed the news to waiting crowds in San Francisco, Sacramento, Omaha, Chicago, and New York that the continent had finally been bound together with steel. Railroad towns sprouted like mushrooms after rain along the completed transcontinental line, each depot becoming the nucleus for communities that rose and fell according to the rhythms of train schedules and shipping rates that connected local fortunes to markets thousands of miles away. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad created new possibilities for moving Western products to Eastern markets, but in the vast grasslands of Texas, millions of cattle waited for a different kind of transportation system, one that would depend on men on horseback rather than steam engines, and on ancient trails worn by buffalo herds rather than steel rails laid across surveyed routes. These cattle, descendants of animals brought to the New World by Spanish conquistadors 3 centuries earlier, had multiplied across the Texas ranges during the Civil War years, when most of the state's men were fighting in distant battles, leaving the Longhorns to breed and roam with a freedom that transformed them into something wilder than domestic livestock and hardier than any creature that had ever carried the label of farm animal. The Texas Longhorn represented evolution in action, as generations of survival pressure had created an animal perfectly adapted to the harsh conditions of the southwestern frontier. Standing 6 feet at the shoulder and weighing up to 1,400 pounds, with horn spreads that could measure 7 feet from tip to tip, these cattle could survive on vegetation that would starve ordinary livestock, could travel 20 miles in a day while maintaining condition, and could defend themselves against wolves, bears, and human predators with horns that were as dangerous as any weapon ever carried by man or beast. Their colours range from solid black to pure white, with every possible combination of spots, stripes and patches that made each animal as distinctive as a fingerprint, while their temperaments range from docile to murderous, with the survival of both cattle and cowboys depending on the ability to read the subtle signs that indicated whether a particular animal was feeling cooperative or homicidal on any given day. Spanish colonizers had introduced cattle to Texas in the 1700s as part of the mission system that was designed to convert native peoples to Christianity and Spanish colonial culture. But the animals had escaped from mission herds to establish feral populations that roamed the South Texas brush country like indigenous wildlife. Mexican vaqueros had developed techniques for working these semi-wild cattle that combined horsemanship skills derived from Moorish cavalry traditions with roping methods adapted to American conditions, creating a system of range management that required no fences, no barns, and no supplemental feeding, but did require men who could think like the animals they were trying to control. The great cattle drives that would define the American West began as economic necessity, when Texas ranchers, impoverished by 4 years of civil war that had cut them off from northern markets, discovered that cattle worth $3 a head in Texas could bring $40 a head in Kansas railroad towns where they could be loaded onto trains bound for Chicago stockyards. The mathematics was simple enough to understand. The practical challenges of moving herds numbering in thousands across hundreds of miles of largely empty country, where hostile Indians, dangerous river crossings, and unpredictable weather could destroy an entire year's work in a matter of hours, proved considerably more complex than arithmetic had suggested. The Chisholm Trail, carved into the landscape by Jesse Chisholm's trading wagons in the 1860s, became the great highway of the cattle kingdom as it stretched from the Texas coastal plains through Oklahoma Territory to Abilene, Kansas, where Joseph McCoy had built stockyards and loading facilities specifically designed to handle the River of Longhorns that began flowing northward after the Civil War. The trail followed river valleys and ridgelines that provided water and grass for the herds, while avoiding the worst terrain that could scatter cattle across miles of broken country, or bog them down in mudflats where quicksand waited to claim animals and riders who made a single wrong step. The Goodnight Loving Trail, pioneered by ranchers Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving, opened a different route that carried Texas cattle northwest to Colorado mining camps and Wyoming ranches, where beef brought premium prices from miners and soldiers who were willing to pay handsomely for fresh meat after months of surviving on salt pork and hardtack. This trail crossed some of the harshest desert country in North America, including stretches where cattle and cowboys could travel for 80 miles without finding water, forcing trail bosses to push their herds in forced marches that tested the endurance of both animals and men to the breaking point. The Western Trail became the longest of the great cattle routes, extending from South Texas to Dodge City, Kansas, and then continuing northward to Nebraska, Wyoming, and Montana territories, where vast grasslands waited for cattle that could survive winters that killed animals accustomed to milder climates. This trail carried an estimated 4 million cattle northward during the peak years of the trail driving era, creating a river of longhorns that flowed across the Great Plains like a seasonal migration that rivaled the buffalo herds for sheer numbers and economic impact. Cowboy life on these great drives demanded skills, endurance, and courage that few occupations have ever required, as men spent months in the saddle guiding herds across country where a moment's inattention could result in stampedes that scattered cattle across miles of prairie, river crossings that drowned animals and riders with equal indifference, and encounters with storms that could turn day to night and unleash lightning, hail, and winds that seemed designed to remind human beings of their insignificance beneath skies that stretched to infinity. The trail drive began before dawn with the sound of the cook banging his triangle and shouting, "Come and get it!" while stars still blazed with cold fire in the darkness above camps, where men had slept on the ground with their saddles for pillows and their horses picketed nearby, ready for the work that would begin with first light and continue until darkness made further travel impossible. Coffee boiled black as sin in pots that never seemed to get completely clean, while bacon fried in skillets seasoned with the grease of 1,000 previous meals, and sourdough biscuits baked in Dutch ovens buried in coals that had been scraped from fires that had burned mesquite, buffalo chips, and whatever other fuel could be found in country where trees were as scarce as honest politicians. The remuda, the herd of horses that accompanied each trail drive, represented the most valuable asset of any outfit. Since cowboys required multiple mounts to handle the different challenges that arose during a typical day of moving cattle across hostile country, each rider maintained a string of 6 to 8 horses, with each animal trained for specific tasks. Cutting horses that could separate individual cattle from the herd with moves as precise as a dancer's, night horses that remained calm during darkness and could feel their way across dangerous ground, swimming horses that could cross rivers while carrying a rider and towing reluctant cattle, and using horses that could work for hours at a steady pace that ate up miles without exhausting themselves or their riders. River crossings represented the most dangerous moments of any trail drive, as cattle that had travelled docilely for days could suddenly panic when faced with fast-moving water, steep banks, or the unfamiliar sensation of swimming while burdened with heavy horns that could pull them under if they lost their nerve. Cowboys stripped to their underwear and urged their horses into torrents that could sweep away anything that lost its footing, while cattle followed reluctantly, their instinct for survival warring with their terror of water that looked deep enough to drown mountains. The Red River, the Canadian, the Arkansas, and dozens of smaller streams claimed their toll of cattle, horses, and men during the peak years of the trail drives, their banks marked with graves of cowboys who had drowned trying to save cattle, worth more than their annual wages, and their waters running muddy with the blood of animals that had been gored by their companions' horns, or swept away by currents that showed no mercy to creatures that had survived droughts, blizzards, and Indian raids, only to meet their end in water that looked deceptively peaceful from a distance. Stampedes erupted from causes as slight as a coyote's howl, a lightning flash, or a cowboy's sneeze at the wrong moment, transforming docile herds into torrents of horns, hooves, and terror that could trample everything in their path while covering miles of prairie in minutes that seemed like hours to riders who spurred their horses alongside the thundering mass of animals, trying to turn the leaders and start the herd milling in circles that would eventually exhaust their panic and allow them to be gathered again. Many cowboys died in stampedes, crushed beneath hooves or thrown from horses that stumbled in prairie dog holes while running at full speed in darkness that made every step a gamble with death. The night horse needed to know his business as well as his rider, picking his way carefully around the sleeping herd while his rider sang "Bury Me Not on the Lone Prairie," "The Old Chisholm Trail," and other ballads that became the soundtrack of the cattle kingdom. Lightning storms turned night herding into a nightmare, as electricity danced on cattle horns and horses' ears, while thunder crashed overhead and rain fell in sheets that made it impossible to see anything beyond arm's length. The cowboy code that emerged from these shared hardships emphasized loyalty, courage, and independence in equal measure, creating an ethos that valued a man's word above his wealth, and his willingness to help others above his ability to help himself. Cowboys shared their food with strangers, gave their horses to men afoot, and risked their lives for cattle that belonged to others, while expecting the same treatment when their own luck ran out, and they needed help from men who understood that survival in the wilderness depended on mutual aid and trust that transcended differences of birth, education, or previous experience. Chuck wagon cooks, universally known as cookie, occupied positions of respect and authority second only to the trail boss, since their ability to provide hot meals and medical care often meant the difference between a successful drive and disaster that scattered men and cattle across hundreds of miles of hostile country. The chuck wagon itself became the mobile headquarters of the trail drive, carrying everything from coffee beans and flour to medicine and ammunition, while Cookie served as doctor, dentist, referee, and sometimes undertaker for crews that might spend months without seeing another human being. Trail towns that sprang up at the northern ends of the great cattle trails became legends of wildness and violence that attracted cowboys, gamblers, gunfighters, and entrepreneurs who understood that men with months of wages in their pockets and months of isolation behind them were ready to spend money on pleasures that had been unavailable on the trail. Abilene, established by Joseph McCoy as the first great cattle shipping point, boasted 21 saloons and numerous brothels catering to cowboys who had driven herds up from Texas and were ready to celebrate the end of months of hard work with whatever entertainment money could buy. Dodge City, positioned where the Western Trail crossed the Arkansas River, became known as the wickedest little city in America, as it catered to trail crews, buffalo hunters, railroad workers, and soldiers from nearby Fort Dodge, who created a volatile mix of armed men, loose money, and limited law enforcement that produced legendary gunfights and a murder rate that exceeded most modern war zones. While cowboys drove their herds northward along trails that connected Texas grasslands to Kansas railheads, another kind of fortune hunter was carving civilization from wilderness in the mountain valleys where precious metals lay hidden in veins of quartz and pockets of placer gravel that had waited since the world was young for human hands to discover their gleaming secrets. The great silver strikes that followed California's gold rush created communities that rose from nothing to rival eastern cities in a matter of months, their populations swelling with dreamers and schemers who understood that the next shovelful of dirt might contain enough wealth to transform a pauper into a millionaire before the sun set on another day of backbreaking labor in mines that burrowed ever deeper into the earth's ancient heart. Virginia City, Nevada, sprouted from the sagebrush desert in 1859, when the legendary Comstock lode revealed silver deposits so rich that a single mine could produce more precious metal in a year than entire nations had extracted from their territories since the beginning of recorded history. The camp that began as a collection of tents and shanties clustered around mine shafts soon boasted opera houses that featured performers imported from European stages, newspapers that employed writers of national reputation, and mansions that rivaled anything built in San Francisco or New York, their ornate facades rising like monuments to human ambition against backdrops of mountains that seemed designed to humble anyone foolish enough to think that wealth could purchase dominion over landscape that had existed since the continents found their present form. The Ophir Mine, the Gould and Curry, the Savage, and other legendary claims transformed Virginia City into what Mark Twain called the livest town for its age and population that America had ever produced, as fortunes were made and lost with a rapidity that made the rise and fall of Eastern business empires seem glacially slow by comparison. Silver ore worth millions of dollars was hauled from tunnels that extended thousands of feet below ground, their passages following veins of metal through rock formations that told the geological history of a continent, while above ground, the city grew with a desperate energy that suggested its inhabitants understood that boom times never lasted long enough for anyone to feel secure in their prosperity. Leadville, Colorado, perched at 10,200 feet above sea level in air so thin that newcomers gasped for breath while climbing stairs that would have presented no challenge at lower elevations, became the silver capital of the world during the 1880s as miners extracted ore from claims that had been dismissed as worthless, until new smelting techniques made it profitable to process metals that earlier prospectors had discarded as waste rock. The town's elevation meant that winter lasted from October to May, with temperatures that could freeze whiskey in bottles and snow that accumulated in drifts 20 feet deep. Yet Leadville's population swelled to more than 30,000 residents who were willing to endure Arctic conditions for the chance to strike it rich in mines, with names like the Little Pittsburgh, the Matchless, and the Chrysolite. Deadwood, South Dakota, exploded into existence in 1875 when gold was discovered in the Black Hills, the sacred Père Sapa of the Lakota people who had been guaranteed permanent possession of these mountains by the Treaty of Fort Laramie just 7 years earlier. The mining camp grew in Deadwood Gulch, a narrow canyon where prospectors panned gold from stream beds while living in conditions that made frontier towns seem luxurious by comparison, their tents and crude log structures packed together so tightly that fires could consume entire neighborhoods in minutes, while residents watched their possessions turn to smoke and ash beneath skies that seemed too blue and peaceful for such earthly disasters. Life in these mining communities followed rhythms dictated by the underground economy that drew men from their beds before dawn and kept them working by candlelight in tunnels where cave-ins, explosions and floods claimed lives with methodical regularity. Saloons opened their doors as soon as miners finished their shifts, offering whiskey that burned like liquid fire and poker games where a man's luck could change his entire future between one card and the next, while dance halls provided female companionship for prices that reflected both the scarcity of women and the abundance of silver dust that miners carried in leather pokes that represented months of dangerous labour in the bowels of the earth. The red light district, as respectable citizens euphemistically called the brothels that operated openly on the back streets of every mining camp, provided services that went far beyond mere physical pleasure, as prostitutes served as nurses for injured miners, banks for men who distrusted formal financial institutions, and confidants for workers whose isolation from family and civilization had created emotional needs that were as real as their hunger for companionship. These women, many of them refugees from economic hardship or domestic violence in eastern cities, found in the mining camps a degree of economic independence that was unavailable to their sisters in more civilized communities, though they paid for that freedom with social ostracism and the constant dangers that attended their profession in towns where violence was as common as morning coffee. Gambling halls operated around the clock, their tables surrounded by men who understood that fortunes extracted from the earth could disappear just as quickly into the pockets of professional gamblers who made their living from human greed and the mathematical certainties of cards, dice, and roulette wheels. Faro, Monte, poker, and dozens of other games of chance created and destroyed more wealth than most of the mines that had drawn men to these remote corners of the continent, while dealers who could manipulate cards with surgical precision separated hopeful miners from their hard-earned silver with skills that bordered on the supernatural. Women like Martha Calamity Jane Canary became legends in these masculine environments by adapting to frontier conditions with a flexibility that confounded conventional assumptions about feminine capabilities and limitations. Calamity Jane, who claimed to have been everything from an army scout to a Pony Express rider, embodied the democratic spirit of mining camps where a person's value was measured by their usefulness, rather than their conformity to social conventions that had been left behind in more settled regions. She could outshoot, outdrink, and outswear most of the men she encountered, while providing nursing care for sick miners and protection for women who found themselves in situations where traditional law enforcement was either absent or ineffective. Female entrepreneurs discovered that mining camps offered business opportunities unavailable in eastern cities, where established commercial networks made it difficult for newcomers to compete with established firms. Women opened boarding houses, restaurants, laundries, and general stores that catered to populations that were overwhelmingly male and desperate for services that reminded them of the domestic comforts they had abandoned in pursuit of mineral wealth. Some accumulated fortunes that rivaled those of successful miners, using business acumen and hard work to build enterprises that survived long after the mines that had created their markets had played out and been abandoned to the elements. The daily rhythm of boom and bust created communities where millionaires and paupers lived side by side, their fortunes separated by the thickness of a playing card or the richness of the next vein of ore that might be discovered in workings that had seemed exhausted the previous day. Men who had eaten breakfast from gold-plated dishes could find themselves begging for meals before sunset, while labourers who had worked for wages could become mine owners overnight if their luck held and their claims proved richer than anyone had dared to hope during the back-breaking work of sinking shafts through rock that seemed designed to resist human ambition. When the ore played out, as it inevitably did in deposits that were rich but finite, these communities faced choices that would determine whether they survived as genuine towns or joined the growing number of ghost towns that dotted the western landscape, like monuments to dreams that had burned too brightly to sustain themselves. Some mining camps successfully transformed themselves into supply centres for ranching or farming operations that could provide steady, if less spectacular, economic foundations for permanent settlement, while others simply withered away as their populations drifted toward newer strikes and fresher hopes of striking it rich in diggings that promised to make previous discoveries seem modest by comparison. Ghost towns scattered across the western mountains stand today as reminders of communities that once rivaled established cities in population, wealth, and cultural sophistication, their empty buildings and silent streets telling stories of human ambition that reached too high and burned too bright to maintain itself, once the natural resources that had created such prosperity were exhausted by the very success they had made possible. The wind that whistles through broken windows and doorways that no longer hold doors carries echoes of voices that once filled these valleys with the sounds of commerce, entertainment, and the eternal human hope that tomorrow would bring better fortune than yesterday had delivered. The same vast distances and sparse population that made mining camps and cattle towns breeding grounds for sudden wealth also created perfect conditions for men who chose to acquire their fortunes through methods that lay outside the boundaries of conventional law and order, in territories where the nearest federal marshal might be hundreds of miles away, and local sheriffs were often outnumbered by the criminals they were supposed to apprehend. Outlaw gangs found sanctuary in badlands where posses could not follow, and hideouts where the normal processes of justice simply could not reach men who had chosen to live by the gun, rather than submit to the restrictions that civilization attempted to impose on human behavior. Jesse Woodson, James and his older brother Alexander Franklin. James had learned the arts of guerrilla warfare during the Civil War while riding with William Quantrill's Confederate raiders, participating in attacks on Union supply lines and civilian targets that blurred the distinction between military action and outright terrorism. When the war ended with Confederate defeat, the James brothers found themselves unable or unwilling to accept the peace that had been negotiated by politicians and generals who had not shared their experiences of raid and counter-raid across the Missouri-Kansas border, where neighbor had fought neighbor with a ferocity that left wounds too deep for any formal treaty to heal completely. The James gang's first bank robbery occurred at Liberty, Missouri, in February 1866, when 12 armed men entered the Clay County Savings Association and walked out with more than $60,000 in cash and bonds, killing an innocent bystander during their escape and establishing a pattern of violence that would characterize their criminal career for the next 16 years. The robbery techniques they employed reflected their military training, as they struck quickly, used superior firepower to overwhelm resistance, and escaped along predetermined routes to hideouts, where friendly civilians provided food, shelter, and information about pursuing lawmen. Jesse James became a folk hero to Confederate sympathizers and other Americans who saw him as a symbol of resistance to the forces of industrial capitalism and federal authority that were transforming the rural society of their childhood into something they no longer recognized or trusted. Newspaper accounts of James gang robberies often portrayed Jesse as a Robin Hood figure who stole from banks and railroads that represented distant corporate power, while distributing his ill-gotten gains among poor farmers and Confederate veterans who had been left behind by the post-war economic boom that enriched northern industrialists but offered little benefit to southern and western agricultural communities. The gang's most audacious robbery occurred at Northfield, Minnesota, in September 1876, when 8 armed men attempted to rob the First National Bank in a town where citizens were better armed and more willing to fight than the outlaws had anticipated. The robbery turned into a running-gun battle that left 2 gang members dead and the surviving outlaws scattered across the countryside, with Jesse and Frank James eventually escaping to hideouts in Tennessee, where they lived under assumed names while 3 of their companions were captured, tried, and imprisoned for their crimes. Henry McCarty, better known to history as Billy the Kid, represented a different type of Western outlaw, whose criminal career grew out of the complex web of political and economic conflicts that characterized territorial New Mexico during the 1870s, when competing factions of businessmen, ranchers, and politicians used violence as a legitimate tool for advancing their interests in a region where federal law enforcement was weak and territorial government was thoroughly corrupt. Billy's involvement in the Lincoln County War began when he took employment with John Tunstall, an English rancher whose business practices threatened the monopolistic control that established merchants exercised over the territorial economy. The murder of John Tunstall in February 1878 by members of a posse that included men affiliated with the Murphy-Dolan faction transformed Billy the Kid from a ranch hand into a participant in what amounted to a private war between competing business interests that used assassination, ambush, and open warfare to settle commercial disputes that courts and territorial officials were either unwilling or unable to resolve through legal processes. Billy's reputation as a deadly gunfighter grew from incidents that were as much military actions as criminal acts, since both sides in the Lincoln County War operated with the tacit approval of territorial officials who had financial interests in the outcome of the conflict. The Kid's legendary status owes as much to the circumstances of his death as to his criminal activities, since Sheriff Pat Garrett's decision to kill Billy during a nighttime encounter at Pete Maxwell's ranch in July 1881 created a martyr whose youth and alleged charm made him a sympathetic figure to Americans who were beginning to romanticize the violence and lawlessness that had characterized the frontier experience. Billy the Kid died at age 21, having allegedly killed 21 men during his brief career, though historians have established that he was actually responsible for no more than 4 deaths, with his reputation inflated by dime novelists and journalists who understood that sensational stories sold more newspapers than careful attention to facts. Robert Leroy Parker, who adopted the alias Butch Cassidy, led what may have been the last great outlaw gang to operate in the American West, assembling a collection of bank and train robbers known as the Wild Bunch, who specialized in spectacular crimes that captured public imagination while demonstrating that the frontier tradition of living outside the law had not disappeared with the closing of the 19th century. Cassidy's gang included Harry Longabore, known as the Sundance Kid, along with other desperados who had chosen outlawry over the mundane occupations that were increasingly available to men who lacked the capital or connections necessary to succeed in legitimate business enterprises. The Wild Bunch operated from hideouts in the hole-in-the-wall country of central Wyoming and Robber's Roost in southeastern Utah, remote locations where pursuing posses found themselves at a severe disadvantage when tracking men who knew every canyon, water source, and escape route in terrain that could shelter armies if they understood how to use its natural defenses effectively. These badlands provided sanctuary for outlaws who had been driven from more accessible regions by improved law enforcement and communication systems that made traditional outlaw tactics increasingly dangerous and unprofitable. Butch Cassidy's reputation rested partly on his policy of avoiding unnecessary killing during robberies, preferring to rely on careful planning, superior firepower, and knowledge of local terrain rather than the gratuitous violence that had characterized earlier outlaw gangs and made them targets of public outrage that eventually resulted in their destruction. The Wild Bunch's train robberies were executed with military precision, using dynamite to open express cars and techniques that minimized the risk to passengers and crew members, while maximizing the gang's chances of escaping with their loot before law enforcement could organize effective pursuit. The legendary lawmen who opposed these outlaw gangs became folk heroes in their own right, their reputations enhanced by journalists and dime novelists who understood that stories about the triumph of good over evil sold better than nuanced accounts of the complex social and economic factors that created conditions where both outlaws and lawmen could achieve legendary status. James Butler Wild Bill Hickok embodied the archetype of the frontier peace officer whose skill with firearms was matched by his willingness to use deadly force when circumstances required immediate action to maintain order in communities where traditional legal processes were inadequate to deal with men who had chosen to live by violence. Wyatt Earp built his reputation as a lawman in Kansas cattle towns, where his primary responsibility involved disarming cowboys who had been paid off after months on the trail and were looking for entertainment that frequently involved alcohol, gambling, and the kind of recreational violence that could easily escalate into serious crimes if not controlled by men who possessed the authority and ability to enforce community standards of behaviour. Earp's methods were often criticised by civil libertarians who believed that peace officers should operate within constitutional limitations, but frontier communities generally supported lawmen who could maintain order through whatever methods proved effective. Bat Masterson combined careers as a lawman, gambler and journalist, demonstrating the fluid nature of social roles in frontier communities where men's reputations depended more on their individual capabilities than on their official positions or social backgrounds. Masterson's skill as a gunfighter was matched by his intelligence and education, qualities that allowed him to transition from frontier sheriff to big city newspaper columnist when the Wild West era came to an end, and American society no longer had a place for men who made their living with weapons. The gunfight at the OK. Corral in Tombstone, Arizona, on October 26, 1881, lasted only 30 seconds but became the most famous armed encounter in Western history, representing the collision between different concepts of law and order that characterized the frontier experience where personal honor, family loyalty, and individual courage often conflicted with the impersonal authority of territorial government and federal law enforcement. While outlaws and lawmen wrote their legends in the dust of cattle towns and mining camps, a far more consequential drama was reaching its climactic moments across the vast grasslands where the last free native nations faced the inexorable advance of American settlement, military power, and the industrial civilization that was transforming the continent with methodical efficiency. The final Indian Wars would determine whether any remnant of the ancient way of life could survive in a landscape increasingly dominated by railroads, telegraph lines, and the geometric precision of surveyed boundaries that reduced the infinite prairie to numbered sections on township plats filed in distant government offices. Sitting Bull, the Hunkpapa Lakota holy man whose visions had guided his people through decades of resistance to American expansion, understood that the approaching conflict would determine the fate of everything his ancestors had held sacred since the first Lakota bands had emerged from the wooded country around Mille Lacs to claim dominion over the buffalo ranges that stretched from the Missouri River to the Bighorn Mountains. His spiritual power, recognized by Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors who had followed him through countless battles, grew from a connection to the land that transcended European concepts of ownership and sovereignty, rooted instead in relationships with Tatanka, the buffalo, and Wakantanka, the great spirit whose presence filled every dawn wind that swept across prairies, where his people had learned to live as part of the eternal cycle of seasons, migrations, and renewal. Crazy Horse, the Oglala war leader whose very name struck fear into the hearts of soldiers who had faced him in combat, embodied a different aspect of Lakota resistance, the warrior tradition that counted coup on enemies not to accumulate wealth or territory, but to demonstrate the courage and skill that marked a man as worthy of respect from his own people and his adversaries alike. His tactical brilliance had been proven in dozens of engagements where small war parties had outmaneuvered and defeated much larger military forces, using knowledge of terrain, weather, and animal behavior that had been refined through generations of warfare against tribal enemies, and adapted with devastating effectiveness against an American army that still thought in terms of European battlefields and conventional military formations. The Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868 had guaranteed Lakota sovereignty over the Black Hills, the Pahasapa where Crazy Horse had received the visions that shaped his understanding of his role as a warrior and protector of his people's sacred places. Yet when gold was discovered in those mountains in 1874, the federal government's promises proved as ephemeral as morning mist, dissolved by the pressure of miners, politicians, and military officers who saw Indian treaty rights as obstacles to be removed rather than legal obligations to be honoured. General George Custer's expedition into the Black Hills, ostensibly a scientific survey but actually a reconnaissance mission designed to confirm reports of gold deposits, brought back specimens and stories that ignited another mining rush and made war inevitable, despite the protests of Indian agents, who who understood that treaty violations would unite the Plains tribes as nothing else could. The concentration of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho bands along the Little Bighorn River in the summer of 1876 represented the largest gathering of Plains Indian military force in recorded history, as thousands of warriors responded to Sitting Bull's call to resist American attempts to confine them to reservations where government agents would control their movements, their children's education, and their spiritual practices. The encampment stretched for miles along the river bottoms where grass grew thick enough to support the vast pony herds that made Plains Indian military mobility possible, while the warriors who filled the lodges represented the culmination of a military tradition that had been perfected through centuries of warfare on the Great Plains. Sitting Bull's vision, received during the Sundance ceremony held before the battle, had shown him soldiers falling into the Indian camp like grasshoppers from the sky, their defeat as certain as the rising sun, but their deaths bringing no permanent victory to the people who would destroy them. The holy man understood, with the tragic clarity that spiritual insight sometimes brings, that military victory would only intensify American determination to crush Lakota resistance, and that the triumph his warriors were about to achieve would ultimately accelerate the destruction of the way of life they were fighting to preserve. General George Armstrong Custer's approach to the Little Bighorn Valley on June 25, 1876, reflected both the arrogance and the tactical incompetence that had characterized American military operations against Plains Indians since the first cavalry patrols had ventured onto the prairie with equipment, training, and assumptions better suited to fighting Confederate infantry than highly mobile warriors who could appear and disappear like spirits across landscape that they knew with an intimacy that no amount of military mapping could duplicate. Custer divided his regiment into 3 separate columns, despite facing an enemy force of unknown size and composition, violating fundamental military principles about concentration of force that had been established by commanders from Alexander the Great to Napoleon Bonaparte. The 7th Cavalry's approach to what the Lakota called the Battle of the Greasy Grass demonstrated the fatal combination of racial prejudice and military overconfidence that had led American officers to consistently underestimate Plains Indian fighting capability. Custer's belief that Indians would flee rather than fight, based on previous encounters with small bands surprised in their winter camps, blinded him to intelligence reports indicating that he was approaching the largest concentration of hostile warriors ever assembled on the northern plains. His decision to attack immediately, without waiting for supporting columns or conducting adequate reconnaissance, reflected both personal ambition and the kind of tactical recklessness that could succeed against demoralized enemies, but proved suicidal when facing opponents who possessed superior numbers, intimate knowledge of the terrain, and the desperate courage of men fighting for their families and their freedom. The battle itself unfolded with a swiftness and completeness that shocked even the Indian participants, as Custer's immediate command of 210 officers and men was surrounded and annihilated in less than an hour of fighting, that left no American survivors to describe the tactical details of their destruction. Lakota and Cheyenne accounts describe a running fight that began when Custer's column appeared on the bluffs overlooking the valley, and ended with the last soldiers making their final stand on the ridge that would forever bear the name of the man whose arrogance had led them to their deaths. The bodies found by later burial parties told their own story of panic and confusion, as disciplined military formations dissolved into desperate individuals fighting for their lives against enemies who showed no more mercy than American forces had shown to Indian women and children at Sand Creek and other massacres that had preceded this moment of retribution. Crazy Horse led many of the charges that swept over Custer's positions, his war cry echoing across the battlefield as he demonstrated the fearlessness in combat that had made him legendary among his own people and respected even by his enemies. His tactical sense and personal courage inspired other warriors to follow him into the heart of the fighting, where his presence seemed to make victory inevitable and defeat unthinkable for men who had followed him through years of successful resistance to American expansion. Yet even as the Lakota and their allies celebrated the greatest military victory in Plains Indian history, the strategic situation that had made the battle necessary remained unchanged. The railroad networks that could transport thousands of replacement soldiers to the frontier, the industrial capacity that could produce unlimited quantities of weapons and ammunition, and the political will to continue military operations until all Indian resistance was crushed, meant that Custer's defeat would ultimately accelerate rather than prevent the final conquest of the Plains tribes. In the desert southwest, Geronimo led the last Apache resistance with a determination and tactical skill that kept American military forces occupied for years, while his small band of followers demonstrated that men who knew the country and possessed the will to keep fighting could defy the overwhelming material superiority of their enemies almost indefinitely. The Apache leader, whose Chiricahua name was Goyakla, had learned the arts of desert warfare in campaigns against Mexican forces that had been attempting to pacify Apache resistance since the colonial period, developing techniques of camouflage, mobility, and surprise attack that made his warriors nearly invisible in terrain where water was scarce. Temperatures could kill the unprepared, and every ridge and canyon offered opportunities for ambush or escape. Geronimo's raids across the border between Arizona Territory and Mexico kept entire military departments mobilized in pursuit of a force that never numbered more than a few dozen fighters, but could strike anywhere across thousands of square miles of desert mountains where conventional military operations were almost impossible to sustain. His ability to disappear into landscape that seemed incapable of supporting human life, to travel vast distances without leaving traces that military scouts could follow, and to obtain supplies and intelligence from Apache communities that remained officially peaceful made him the most wanted man in the American Southwest during the 1880s, where newspapers followed his exploits with the kind of fascination usually reserved for celebrities rather than enemies of the state. His final surrender in 1886 marked the end of active Apache resistance and the beginning of an exile that would take him and his followers far from the desert mountains where their ancestors had lived since the world was young. Transported to prison camps in Florida and Alabama, where many would die from diseases and conditions that their desert-adapted bodies could not survive. The massacre at Wounded Knee Creek on December 29, 1890, ended the Indian Wars not with military victory but with the systematic slaughter of men, women, and children whose crime had been participation in the ghost dance, a religious movement that promised the return of the buffalo herds and the restoration of native dominion over lands that had been taken by conquest and treaty violation. The 7th Cavalry, seeking to avenge their humiliation at Little Bighorn 14 years earlier, opened fire on Bigfoot's band of Miniconjou Lakota with artillery and rifles that killed more than 150 people, most of them unarmed, while suffering minimal casualties themselves in what could only be described as a massacre rather than a battle. The reservation system that confined surviving native peoples to bounded territories represented the final destruction of the relationship between indigenous peoples and the land that had sustained their cultures for millennia, transforming hunters and warriors into dependent populations whose survival depended on government rations, and whose children would be educated in schools designed to eliminate every trace of tribal identity and cultural memory. The same forces that had crushed the last native resistance to American expansion were simultaneously transforming the cattle kingdom that had flourished on the Great Plains during the brief decades when grass was free, water was abundant, and the range seemed large enough to support unlimited herds that could roam across territories larger than European nations without encountering the boundaries that would eventually divide the prairie into individually owned parcels marked by fences that stretched to every horizon. The invention of barbed wire in 1874 represented a technological revolution as significant as the steam engine or the telegraph in its impact on Western development, providing farmers and ranchers with an economical method of enclosing land that had previously remained open to anyone bold enough to claim it, and strong enough to defend it against competitors who operated according to the ancient principle that possession was 9/10 of the law. Joseph Glidden's simple improvement to existing wire fencing, the addition of sharp barbs that would deter cattle from pushing through or breaking down barriers, solved the fundamental problem that had prevented agricultural development on the Great Plains, where timber for traditional rail fences was scarce and expensive, while stone for walls was either unavailable or prohibitively costly to transport and install across the vast distances that enclosed farms and ranches required for profitable operation. The new wire could be manufactured in eastern factories and shipped by railroad to any point where settlement was expanding, providing farmers with the means to protect their crops from wandering livestock and ranchers, with the ability to control breeding, prevent overgrazing, and establish clear property boundaries that courts could recognize and enforce according to legal principles that had been developed in regions where land ownership had never been disputed by competing claims or challenged by the presence of unfenced ranges that had been treated as common property. The transformation of the open range began slowly as homesteaders used barbed wire to fence small plots, where they attempted to grow crops that could survive on the limited rainfall that characterized much of the Great Plains, but accelerated rapidly as railroad companies, land speculators, and large ranching operations discovered that fencing provided them with legal and practical advantages that more than compensated for the initial investment required to purchase and install thousands of miles of wire, posts, and the labor necessary to create barriers that could withstand prairie winds, temperature extremes, and the efforts of both animals and humans to breach or destroy them. The psychological impact of fencing on cowboys and ranchers who had grown accustomed to the freedom of movement that had characterized the open range era proved as significant as the practical consequences of enclosure, as men who had lived their entire adult lives without encountering boundaries that they could not cross found themselves confronting a landscape increasingly divided into geometric patterns that reflected the surveyor's craft rather than the natural contours of valleys, ridges, and watersheds that had guided human movement across the continent since the retreat of the last glaciers. The romance of the unfenced range, where a man's ambition was limited only by his courage and his ability to handle cattle and horses under conditions that tested every aspect of character and skill, gave way to the mundane realities of maintaining fences, checking boundary markers, and dealing with neighbours whose interests might conflict with traditional ranching practices that had assumed unlimited access to grass and water. Fence-cutting wars erupted across Texas and other cattle states as cowboys, small ranchers, and trail drivers found their traditional routes blocked by wire barriers that forced them to travel hundreds of additional miles to reach destinations that had previously been accessible by direct routes across what they continued to regard as public domain despite legal documents that granted private ownership to individuals and corporations that had never seen the land they claimed. The violence that accompanied these conflicts reflected deeper tensions between different concepts of property rights, with older settlers believing that custom and prior use created legitimate claims that should be respected regardless of legal technicalities, while newer arrivals insisted that properly recorded deeds and legally established boundaries took precedence over informal arrangements that had developed during the chaotic years when territorial government was weak and federal law enforcement was virtually non-existent. The conflict between proponents of open range and advocates of agricultural development intensified during the 1880s as homesteaders continued to arrive in increasing numbers, encouraged by railroad promotional campaigns that promised fertile soil, adequate rainfall, and profitable markets for crops that could be transported economically to eastern cities, where growing urban populations provided expanding demand for agricultural products that could be grown more cheaply on western lands than in established farming regions where land prices had been inflated by decades of settlement and development. The winter of 1886-87 delivered nature's own verdict on the sustainability of open-range cattle ranching, as practiced during the boom years of the 1870s and early 1880s, when ranchers had stocked their ranges with numbers of cattle that exceeded the carrying capacity of the grasslands during periods of environmental stress that periodically afflicted the Great Plains with droughts, blizzards, and other climatic extremes that could devastate herds that had been managed according to assumptions about normal weather conditions that proved disastrously wrong when abnormal conditions persisted for months at a time. The first blizzard struck in November, arriving earlier than usual with temperatures that dropped below zero and stayed there for days, while winds that exceeded 60 miles per hour created blizzard conditions that made it impossible for cattle to find shelter or food in areas where they had grazed successfully during milder seasons. Cowboys who attempted to rescue stranded herds found themselves fighting for their own survival in weather that could freeze exposed flesh in minutes and kill anyone who became separated from shelter during storms that lasted for days without interruption. December brought a brief warming period that raised hopes that the worst had passed, but the temporary thaw was followed by freezing rain that coated the prairie grasses with ice, thick enough to prevent cattle from pouring through to reach the vegetation that represented their only source of food during winter months when hay was unavailable and supplemental feeding was impractical across the vast distances that characterized open-range operations. Cattle that had survived the November blizzards began dying of starvation as they exhausted their body reserves while unable to access the grass that lay beneath barriers of ice that their hooves could not break through. The January blizzard of 1887 brought the final catastrophe as temperatures plummeted to 50 degrees below zero, while winds that seemed to have blown directly from the Arctic Circle created conditions that killed cattle by the thousands. Their frozen carcasses scattered across the prairie like monuments to human overconfidence in the face of natural forces that recognized no human claims to dominion over climate, weather, or the fundamental relationship between animal populations and the environmental resources required to sustain them through seasonal variations that had shaped the ecology of the Great Plains since the end of the Pleistocene Ice Age. When spring finally arrived and the snow melted to reveal the magnitude of the disaster, ranchers discovered that their herds had been reduced by percentages that range from 50% to total loss, with some operations losing 90% of their cattle to weather conditions that had exposed the fundamental weakness of ranching systems that depended on natural grass. Minimal human intervention and environmental conditions that remained within the narrow range of variation that had characterized the relatively mild decades during which the cattle kingdom had appeared to offer unlimited opportunities for men with sufficient capital and risk tolerance to establish operations on the public domain. The economic consequences of the disaster extended far beyond individual ranchers to affect the entire regional economy that had developed around the cattle trade, as banks that had financed range operations found themselves holding worthless paper secured by dead cattle, while supply companies that had extended credit to ranchers faced bankruptcy when their customers could no longer pay for goods and services that had been purchased during the prosperous years that preceded the climatic catastrophe. Entire communities that had grown up around cattle shipping points discovered that their economic foundation had been destroyed by weather conditions that no amount of human planning or effort could have prevented. The Johnson County War of 1892 represented the violent climax of the conflict between large cattle operations that had dominated Wyoming Territory during the open range era and the homesteaders, small ranchers, and townspeople who were transforming the region into a more diversified agricultural economy where cattle raising would continue but within a framework of individual property ownership, legal boundaries, and democratic governance that reflected the interests of the majority rather than the economic power of a few large operators who had grown accustomed to exercising political and economic control over vast territories. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association, representing the major cattle barons who had built their fortunes during the open range years, hired a small army of gunmen to eliminate rustlers and homesteaders who they claimed were stealing cattle and illegally occupying land that belonged to established ranching operations. Though the real issue was political and economic control over a region that was undergoing fundamental transformation as territorial status gave way to statehood and population growth, brought democratic pressures that threatened the oligarchic system that had characterized frontier Wyoming. The invasion force of hired gunmen, accompanied by prominent cattlemen who were determined to settle the conflict through violence rather than legal processes that might not produce the results they desired, represented the last attempt by cattle barons to maintain their dominance through methods that had been effective during the territorial period, but were no longer sustainable in an era when federal law enforcement, state government, and public opinion had evolved to support democratic institutions rather than the private armies that wealthy individuals had previously been able to employ with impunity. The transformation from open range to modern ranching reflected broader changes in American society as the frontier era gave way to an industrial economy where success depended more on business acumen, technological adaptation, and integration with national markets than on the individual courage and physical skills that had characterized earlier phases of Western development. The transformation from open range to fenced farmland represented more than an economic shift or technological adaptation. It marked the end of an epoch that had shaped the American character since the first colonists pushed beyond the Appalachian Mountains in search of land, opportunity, and the indefinable something that seemed to beckon from horizons that retreated endlessly westward, like promises that could never quite be grasped, but never quite abandoned either. This realization struck the nation with particular force in 1890, when the United States Census Bureau issued a brief statement that would reverberate through American consciousness for generations. Up to and including 1880, the country had a frontier of settlement, but at present the unsettled area has been so broken into by isolated bodies of settlement that there can hardly be said to be a frontier line. These matter-of-fact words, buried in bureaucratic language that seemed designed to minimize their significance, announced the end of the most distinctive feature of American development since the founding of Jamestown and Plymouth Colony. For nearly 3 centuries, there had always been a frontier line beyond which lay free land, new opportunities, and the chance for any individual to remake themselves according to their own vision of what life could become when freed from the accumulated restrictions and expectations of established society. The census takers who compiled the 1890 report were simply recording statistical reality, but they were also documenting the closing of what had been America's most fundamental defining characteristic. The frontier line had moved inexorably westward with each passing decade, carrying with it the hopes and dreams of millions of Americans who saw in the vast emptiness beyond settled regions not merely vacant land, but the raw material from which better lives could be constructed. From the first tentative settlements beyond the fall line of eastern rivers to the final homesteads carved from western deserts and mountain valleys, the frontier had provided what economists would later call a safety valve, a release mechanism that drained away the social and economic pressures that might otherwise have built to explosive levels in the increasingly crowded cities and worn-out farmlands of the eastern seaboard. Frederick Jackson Turner, a young historian from Wisconsin who had grown up on the edge of the retreating frontier and witnessed its transformation from wilderness to settled farmland within his own lifetime, understood the profound implications of the Census Bureau's announcement better than most of his contemporaries. In 1893, addressing the American Historical Association at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, Turner presented his revolutionary thesis on the significance of the frontier in American history, arguing that the existence of an area of free land, its continuous recession, and the advance of American settlement westward explain American development. Turner's thesis challenged prevailing historical interpretations that traced American institutions to their European origins, particularly the Germanic germ theory that attributed American democracy to racial characteristics inherited from Teutonic ancestors. Instead, Turner argued that American character had been forged in the crucible of frontier experience, shaped by the meeting point between savagery and civilization, where European settlers were transformed into something entirely new through their struggle with the wilderness. According to Turner, American democracy was born of no theorist's dream. It was not carried in the Susan Constant to Virginia, nor in the Mayflower to Plymouth. It came out of the American forest, and it gained new strength each time it touched a new frontier. The safety valve theory that emerged from Turner's analysis suggested that free land had provided an essential mechanism for maintaining social stability and economic opportunity in American society, absorbing surplus population from crowded eastern cities while offering alternatives to industrial wage labor that might otherwise have created the kind of class conflicts that plagued European nations. As long as dissatisfied workers, failed farmers, and ambitious young men could head west to claim their own land and build their own futures, American society remained fluid and democratic in ways that rigid social hierarchies could never accommodate. The psychological impact of endless space had shaped American attitudes toward authority, individual rights, and social relationships in ways that distinguished the United States from nations where land was scarce, population was dense, and established institutions controlled access to opportunity. Turner argued that frontier conditions had fostered that restless nervous energy, that dominant individualism, working for good and for evil, and with all that buoyancy and exuberance which comes with freedom, that characterized American culture even in regions that had never experienced frontier conditions directly. The frontier had served as more than just an economic safety valve. It had functioned as a cultural laboratory where traditional European social forms were broken down and reconstructed according to principles of equality, self-reliance, and practical problem-solving that emerged naturally from conditions where survival depended more on individual capability than inherited status. In frontier communities, Turner observed, there was no need for standing armies, established churches, aristocrats or nobles. There was no landed gentry who controlled the land or charged heavy rents and fees, but the closing of the frontier meant that this unique American experience was ending, and Turner wondered what would replace the transformative influence that free land had exercised on American development. Movement has been its dominant fact, Turner wrote, and unless this training has no effect upon a people, the American energy will continually demand a wider field for its exercise. But never again will such gifts of free land offer themselves. The question that haunted Turner and his contemporaries was whether American democracy and individualism could survive without the frontier conditions that had created them. The closing of the frontier coincided with the emergence of the United States as a continental nation, whose influence extended far beyond its own borders, a development that represented both the culmination of manifest destiny and the beginning of a new phase in American history where internal expansion would be replaced by external engagement with global affairs. The same restless energy that had driven American settlement westward across prairies and mountains would soon manifest itself in overseas expansion, industrial development, and the emergence of the United States as a world power whose decisions would affect the destiny of nations and peoples far from the shores of North America. The continental nation that emerged from the frontier experience possessed resources, territory, and population that rivaled any power on earth, unified by railroad networks that could move armies and supplies across thousands of miles, connected by telegraph lines that made instant communication possible between regions that had been weeks apart just decades earlier, and bound together by shared experiences of frontier hardship, opportunity, and transformation that had created a distinctly American identity, despite the diverse origins of the people who had participated in westward expansion. Turner argued that the frontier had created a national character marked by coarseness and strength, combined with acuteness and inquisitiveness, that practical, inventive turn of mind, quick to find expedients, that masterful grasp of material things, lacking in the artistic but powerful to effect great ends. These characteristics, forged in the wilderness and refined through generations of frontier experience, would prove essential to American success in the industrial age that followed the closing of the frontier, providing the cultural foundation for technological innovation, entrepreneurial risk-taking, and the kind of large-scale thinking that could envision and execute projects like the Transcontinental Railroad, the Panama Canal, and eventually the exploration of space itself. The democratic ideals that Turner identified as products of frontier experience, equality of opportunity, individual merit over inherited privilege, skepticism toward established authority, and faith in the common man's ability to govern himself, would become America's greatest export to a world still largely governed by monarchies, aristocracies, and other forms of hierarchical authority that the frontier experience had taught Americans to distrust and ultimately to reject. Yet the achievements that flowed from frontier expansion came at costs that Turner and his generation were only beginning to understand. As the environmental consequences of rapid development, the cultural destruction of Native American societies, and the human toll of violent conquest became impossible to ignore or rationalize away, the same energy and determination that had built a continental nation had also devastated landscapes that had remained unchanged for millennia, destroyed ways of life that had sustained complex societies for thousands of years, and normalized levels of violence that left scars across the American psyche that would take generations to heal. The buffalo herds that had numbered in millions were reduced to a few hundred survivors preserved in zoos and private reserves, their destruction representing not just the loss of individual animals, but the collapse of entire ecosystems that had sustained Plains Indian civilizations and countless other species that depended on the great migrations for their survival. Forests that had taken centuries to grow were clear-cut in decades to provide lumber for frontier construction, fuel for railroad locomotives, and cleared land for agricultural settlement, leaving behind scarred landscapes where erosion, flooding, and soil depletion testified to the environmental price of rapid expansion. The cultural cost proved even more devastating as Native American societies that had maintained their distinctive identities and traditions through centuries of contact with European colonizers found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer scale and intensity of American expansion during the 19th century. Languages that had preserved oral traditions stretching back to the world's creation were silenced. Spiritual practices that connected peoples to sacred places were forbidden, and children were removed from their families to attend schools designed to eliminate every trace of their cultural heritage. The human cost of frontier expansion, measured not just in lives lost during conflicts, but in the psychological trauma inflicted on both conquerors and conquered, created wounds that would influence American attitudes toward violence, authority, and cultural difference for generations after the frontier itself had disappeared. The mythology of the Wild West that emerged from this traumatic experience would romanticize what had actually been a violent and often tragic process of conquest and settlement, creating cultural narratives that celebrated individual heroism while obscuring the broader patterns of environmental destruction and cultural genocide that had made American expansion possible. Turner concluded his famous address with the observation that the frontier has gone, and with its going has closed the first period of American history. But he could not have foreseen how completely the frontier experience would shape American responses to the challenges that awaited the nation in the 20th century and beyond. The same restless energy, technological optimism, and democratic idealism that had driven westward expansion would soon be directed toward new frontiers in science, industry, and global leadership, carrying both the achievements and the contradictions of the frontier experience into an uncertain future where American power would be tested on stages far larger than the Great Plains or the Sierra Nevada. Even as Turner was announcing the closing of the frontier to academic audiences in Chicago, the American West was being reborn in a form that would prove more durable and influential than the historical reality it claimed to represent, transformed from lived experience into popular entertainment that could be packaged, marketed, and sold to audiences who hungered for adventure, romance, and heroism in an increasingly industrialized society that seemed to offer fewer opportunities for individual courage and authentic experience. The man most responsible for this transformation was William Frederick Buffalo Bill Cody, whose Wild West exhibitions turned the brutal realities of frontier conflict into spectacular entertainment that would shape American and European perceptions of the West for generations after the last Indian War had ended and the final cattle drive had reached the railroad. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, which debuted in 1883 and toured continuously for 30 years, represented a masterpiece of what would later be called infotainment, combining authentic Western personalities, genuine frontier skills, and dramatic recreations of historical events into a seamless spectacle that audiences accepted as both educational and thrilling. Cody understood intuitively that Americans needed to believe their frontier experience had been noble and heroic, rather than merely violent and acquisitive, and his shows provided carefully crafted narratives that celebrated individual courage, technological progress, and the inevitable triumph of civilization over savagery, without dwelling too deeply on the environmental destruction, cultural genocide, and economic exploitation that had actually characterized much of Western development. The show's format evolved from Cody's earlier theatrical productions into elaborate outdoor spectacles that could accommodate thousands of spectators, while featuring hundreds of performers representing every major group that had participated in Western expansion. Cowboys demonstrating roping and riding skills that had been developed on actual cattle ranges, soldiers recreating cavalry charges that echoed real military campaigns, and Native Americans performing dances and war ceremonies that their grandfathers had conducted in earnest before reservation confinement had reduced such activities to tourist attractions. The shows brought before American and European audiences a romanticized version of frontier life that transformed confusing and often contradictory historical experiences into orderly and predictable performances that spectators found both informative and entertaining. Sitting Bull himself appeared in Buffalo Bill's show during the 1885 season. The great Lakota leader who had orchestrated Custer's destruction at Little Bighorn, now reduced to performing for audiences who cheered his presence, while remaining oblivious to the tragic irony of his situation. The holy man who had once received visions of soldiers falling like grasshoppers from the sky, now found himself part of a travelling entertainment that celebrated the very forces that had destroyed his people's way of life, his participation lending authenticity to spectacles that systematically misrepresented the nature and meaning of the conflicts in which he had played such a crucial role. Annie Oakley, the diminutive sharpshooter from Ohio who could outshoot most men with rifle, pistol, or shotgun, became the show's most popular performer and the first female superstar of American popular culture, her precision marksmanship and theatrical charm proving that Western skills and frontier independence were not exclusively masculine qualities. Her performances, which included splitting playing cards edgewise at 30 paces and shooting cigarettes from her husband's lips, demonstrated that the democratic ideals supposedly fostered by frontier experience extended to gender relationships as well as social class, though her success as an entertainer depended partly on her ability to combine deadly accuracy with feminine charm in ways that reassured audiences about the compatibility of women's rights with traditional domestic values. The show's elaborate recreations of historical events, including Custer's last stand and various Indian battles, presented frontier violence as tragic but necessary episodes in the march of progress, with Native Americans portrayed as noble but doomed opponents whose resistance to American expansion had been both understandable and ultimately futile. These performances, which featured actual veterans of frontier conflicts on both sides, transformed historical tragedies into entertainment spectacles that allowed audiences to experience the excitement of frontier warfare without confronting its moral ambiguities or acknowledging the human costs of continental conquest. Dime novels, which had begun appearing in the 1860s and reached their peak popularity during the 1880s and 1890s, created the literary foundation for Western mythology by establishing character types, plot formulas, and thematic patterns that would dominate popular representations of the frontier experience for more than a century. Publishers like Beadle and Adams discovered that stories about Western heroes could be produced cheaply and sold profitably to working-class readers who were hungry for adventure stories that celebrated individual courage and democratic values while providing escape from the routine of industrial labor and urban life. The dime novel cowboy hero, exemplified by characters like Deadwood Dick and Buffalo Bill, possessed supernatural marksmanship, unwavering moral principles, and the ability to triumph over any odds through a combination of skill, courage, and righteous determination that made him the perfect protagonist for stories that needed to resolve complex social and economic conflicts through individual action rather than collective political engagement. These fictional heroes could accomplish what real historical figures could not. They could use violence to establish justice, impose order on chaos, and protect innocent victims without becoming corrupted by the brutality that such activities would require in actual practice. The novel's formulaic plots typically involved lone heroes who arrived in troubled communities where corrupt officials, ruthless businessmen, or savage Indians threatened the lives and property of decent citizens who lacked the skills or courage necessary to defend themselves. The hero's intervention, usually involving spectacular displays of marksmanship and horsemanship, would eliminate the threat and restore peace and justice to the community before he rode away to seek new adventures, leaving behind grateful townspeople who could now prosper under the protection of laws that his violent intervention had made effective. Hollywood's adoption of Western themes, beginning with early silent films and evolving through successive generations of movie stars and directors, transformed dime novel formulas into visual spectacles that could reach mass audiences with unprecedented effectiveness, creating a mythology of the American West that would influence global perceptions of American character and values throughout the 20th century and beyond. Tom Mix, the first great Western movie star, established the template for cinematic cowboys with films that emphasize spectacular stunts, elaborate costumes, and clear moral distinctions between heroes and villains that could be communicated effectively through visual storytelling rather than verbal exposition. John Wayne's emergence as the archetypal Western hero during the 1930s and 1940s coincided with America's rise to global leadership, and his portrayal of strong, silent protagonists who used violence reluctantly but effectively to protect civilization from barbarism provided audiences with reassuring fantasies about American power and moral authority during periods when such certainty was desperately needed to sustain national confidence in the face of depression, World War, and Cold War anxieties. Modern Westerns, from the revisionist films of the 1960s and 1970s through contemporary productions, that attempt to acknowledge the complexity and moral ambiguity of frontier experience, continue to grapple with the tension between mythological expectations and historical reality, reflecting changing American attitudes toward violence, cultural difference, and the environmental and social costs of national expansion that earlier generations had been able to ignore or rationalize away. The persistent gap between Western mythology and historical reality reflects deeper tensions in American culture between democratic ideals and imperial practices, between celebration of individual freedom and acknowledgement of collective responsibility, and between nostalgia for a simpler past and recognition of the moral complexities that have always characterized American expansion and development. The mythic West continues to offer Americans a vision of themselves as heroic individuals capable of overcoming any challenge through personal courage and moral determination, while the historical West reminds them that such achievements have always come at costs that must be honestly acknowledged and carefully weighed against the benefits they have produced. The transformation of historical experience into popular mythology did not mean that the actual West disappeared entirely, but rather that it continued to evolve in ways that reflected both continuity with frontier traditions and adaptation to the economic, technological, and social changes that have reshaped American society since Turner announced the closing of the frontier more than a century ago. Modern ranching operations across the Great Plains and Intermountain West still employ cowboys whose daily routines would be recognizable to their 19th century predecessors, even though satellite-guided tractors have replaced most horse-drawn equipment and cell phones have eliminated much of the isolation that once characterized life on the range. Contemporary cowboys still rise before dawn to check cattle, repair fences, and move herds between pastures according to seasonal rhythms that have remained essentially unchanged since the first longhorns were driven north from Texas to Kansas railheads. Though modern transportation, veterinary medicine, and market integration have made ranching far more predictable and profitable than it was during the boom and bust cycles that characterized the open range era. The skills that matter most in modern ranch work, horsemanship, animal husbandry, weather prediction, and the kind of practical problem-solving that can adapt to unexpected challenges, remain fundamentally the same capabilities that successful ranchers have always needed, regardless of the technological tools available to support their efforts. The cowboy code that emerged from trail drive experiences continues to influence ranch culture and Western communities, emphasizing personal reliability, mutual assistance, and the kind of independence that comes from being able to handle whatever problems arise without waiting for outside help that might not arrive in time to prevent disaster. These values, forged in the crucible of frontier experience, provide stability and continuity in communities where economic pressures, environmental challenges, and cultural change constantly threaten to undermine the foundations of rural life. Native American nations have survived the cultural genocide attempted during the reservation era and have emerged in the contemporary period as sovereign political entities that maintain complex relationships with federal and state governments, while working to preserve languages, traditions, and spiritual practices that federal policy once sought to eliminate entirely. The same tribes that fought the final Indian Wars have established successful gaming enterprises, natural resource management programs, and cultural preservation initiatives that demonstrate their ability to adapt to modern economic conditions while maintaining distinctive identities rooted in relationships with ancestral lands that have sustained their peoples for millennia. Tribal colleges and universities across the West now offer educational opportunities that combine traditional knowledge with contemporary skills, preparing young Native Americans to participate in the modern economy while remaining connected to cultural traditions that provide meaning and identity in ways that mainstream American society cannot duplicate. Language immersion programs, traditional craft instruction, and ceremonial practices that were nearly destroyed during the assimilation era are experiencing renaissance as tribal communities recognize that cultural survival requires active efforts to transmit traditional knowledge to each generation. The legal framework of tribal sovereignty, established through treaties that were honored more in the breach than in the observance during the 19th century, has been revitalized through court decisions and federal legislation that recognize native nations' inherent rights to self-governance, resource management, and cultural preservation. This legal renaissance has enabled tribes to protect sacred sites, manage natural resources according to traditional principles, and maintain governmental systems that reflect indigenous values rather than imposed European models. Western towns that survived the boom and bust cycles of mining, ranching, and railroad development have found new economic foundations in tourism industries that market their historical significance and scenic beauty to visitors who seek authentic experiences of the American West, though the tension between historical preservation and economic development continues to shape community decisions about growth, development, and cultural identity. Places like Tombstone, Arizona, and Deadwood, South Dakota have transformed themselves from genuine frontier communities into carefully managed historical attractions that provide visitors with sanitized versions of their violent and chaotic pasts, complete with staged gunfights, period costumes, and guided tours that emphasize entertainment value over historical accuracy. The challenge of maintaining authenticity while generating sufficient revenue to support community infrastructure creates ongoing tensions between long-time residents who remember when these towns served genuine economic functions and newcomers whose livelihoods depend on satisfying tourist expectations about what the real West should look like. Many Western communities have discovered that their most valuable economic resource is their historical reputation, but that marketing this reputation effectively requires them to conform to popular expectations that may bear little resemblance to their actual historical experiences. Rural Western towns that lack significant tourist attractions face different challenges as agricultural consolidation, resource depletion, and technological change reduce employment opportunities and population, leaving behind communities where the median age continues to rise and young people migrate to urban areas where education and career opportunities are more readily available. These communities struggle to maintain essential services, preserve local businesses, and sustain the social networks that have traditionally provided stability and identity in regions where geographical isolation and economic vulnerability make collective action essential for survival. The landscape itself remains the most enduring legacy of the frontier experience, preserved in national parks, wilderness areas, and other protected lands that allow contemporary Americans to experience something approximating the natural conditions that shaped frontier development and continue to influence Western identity. Yellowstone, established in 1872 as the world's first national park, preserves geothermal features, wildlife populations, and ecosystem relationships that existed before European contact, providing visitors with glimpses of what Lewis and Clark encountered during their journey across the Louisiana Purchase. The National Park Service, created in 1916 to manage an expanding system of protected areas, has evolved into an institution that attempts to balance preservation of natural and cultural resources with public access and education, reflecting ongoing debates about the proper relationship between human society and the natural environment that have characterized American thought since the frontier period. These protected landscapes serve as laboratories for ecological research, refuges for endangered species, and spiritual sanctuaries for people who seek connection with natural processes that industrial society has largely eliminated from daily experience. Western national parks also preserve evidence of Native American occupation that spans thousands of years, from ancient cliff dwellings in Mesa Verde to traditional hunting grounds in Glacier National Park, demonstrating the complexity and sophistication of indigenous societies that Euro-American settlers either ignored or systematically misrepresented during the conquest period. These archaeological and cultural sites provide contemporary visitors with opportunities to understand the depth and richness of Native American history, while recognizing the devastating impact that European expansion had on peoples who had successfully maintained sustainable relationships with Western landscapes for countless generations. The vast spaces that once defined the frontier experience continue to shape Western consciousness and identity, offering residents and visitors alike a sense of possibility and freedom that remains difficult to find in more densely settled regions where human activities have eliminated most traces of natural processes and ecological relationships. The Western sky, vast and changeable as the dreams that brought millions of Americans across the continent in search of better lives, still holds the promise that tomorrow might bring something better than yesterday delivered. Though the frontiers that beckon contemporary Americans lie in realms of technology, space exploration, and global engagement rather than territorial expansion across a continent that has been thoroughly mapped, surveyed, and divided among competing claims that courts can recognize and enforce. In the span of a single century, from Lewis and Clark's first tentative steps beyond the Mississippi in 1803 to the Census Declaration of 1890 that the frontier line had disappeared, an entire continent was transformed with a speed and thoroughness that staggers the imagination. Vast buffalo-dark prairies that had rolled unbroken to horizons lost in infinity became a geometric tapestry of farms, ranches, and towns connected by steel rails that could carry a man from New York to San Francisco in less than a week. Ancient hunting grounds where native nations had followed seasonal migrations for thousands of years were divided into townships and sections, their boundaries marked by surveyors' chains and recorded in courthouse ledgers that reduced the sacred to the commercial, the infinite to the measurable. The transformation happened so swiftly that men who had trapped beaver in unnamed mountain valleys lived to see those same peaks surrounded by mining camps, railroad stations, and tourist hotels, their wilderness solitude replaced by the whistle of locomotives and the bustle of commerce. Emigrants who had struggled across the Oregon Trail in ox-drawn wagons returned decades later as passengers on transcontinental trains, watching from comfortable sleeping cars as their former ordeal passed beneath them at speeds that compressed weeks of dangerous travel into days of scenic luxury. The America that emerged from this continental metamorphosis bore little physical resemblance to the wilderness that had confronted the first pioneers, yet the experience of transformation itself had become the nation's defining characteristic. The American character that emerged from this crucible of continental conquest carried within itself the restless energy, democratic optimism and fierce individualism that frontier conditions had demanded for survival and rewarded with success. The willingness to abandon the familiar in pursuit of something better, the faith that individual effort could overcome any obstacle, and the conviction that tomorrow held more promise than yesterday. These qualities, forged in the vast spaces between the Mississippi and the Pacific, continue to shape American responses to challenges that the pioneers could never have imagined. The frontier spirit that once drove covered wagons across trackless prairies now propels spacecraft toward distant planets, launches entrepreneurs toward undiscovered markets, and sustains the eternal American belief that any horizon can be reached by those bold enough to attempt the journey. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep beneath that same western sky that watched over mountain men and miners, cowboys and emigrants, the stars that guided wagon trains across the Oregon Trail still wheel overhead in their ancient patterns, holding within their silent light all the stories we have shared, the triumph and tragedy, the courage and folly, the dreams fulfilled and broken that created the America we know today. The frontier may be closed, but the frontier spirit endures, carried forward by each generation that inherits the restless hope that somewhere beyond the next ridge, across the next river, or perhaps among the stars themselves, lies the promise of something better than what came before.